Hours passed slowly. The wind outside picked up, rattling the windows. I tried to sleep but kept waking to small noises. Creaks, the rustle of leaves, the faintest thump against the cabin wall. My mind refused to stop imagining someone out there, moving silently between the trees. I tried to convince myself I was alone, that it was probably just animals. But the sound of deliberate footsteps in the dirt outside kept me awake. At one point, I got up and peered out the window. The forest was black, impossible to see through. I strained my eyes, trying to spot anything moving. I thought I saw a shadow, something taller than a deer, moving slowly behind the trees. My pulse jumped, and I pulled back. I checked my phone, no signal. The isolation hit me fully then. If something happened, no one would know for hours. Panic set in. I tried to stay rational, telling myself the forest played tricks on the eyes at night, that shadows can look like shapes we recognize. But it didn't ease the fear. Around midnight, the sound outside grew louder. I heard something scrape against the side of the cabin, slow and deliberate. I held my breath, my body frozen. Every instinct screamed to leave, but I knew the forest outside was dark and impossible to navigate. The sound stopped suddenly, and I waited, heart hammering, ears straining. Then, the sound of footsteps again, moving slowly in a circle, like someone walking around to find a point of entry. I realized that they could be trying to open the door or window. My fear turned into urgent awareness. I had to be ready. I grabbed a heavy metal poker from the fireplace and sat near the door. I could hear my own breathing, loud and uneven. The footsteps stopped for a moment, and the silence was suffocating. Then came a small thud on the porch. I tensed, ready to swing the poker, but I didn't see anything. The porch was empty, but the thud came again, closer this time. I realized someone had thrown a small rock at the door. My heart was racing so fast it hurt. I stayed there, tense and ready, for what felt like hours. Eventually, the noises stopped. The wind outside grew louder, and I could hear nothing else. I didn't sleep that night, only sitting by the door, waiting, listening to every sound. By morning, the forest seemed calm, but my nerves were raw. I inspected the perimeter carefully, looking for footprints. I found several sets, large, boot-like prints circling the cabin. They were fresh, probably from the night before. Whoever had been there had stayed just outside, watching. The rest of the day I spent preparing for my departure. I packed my things quickly, collecting the firewood I had brought in case I needed it for defense. The forest felt menacing now, each rustle of leaves or snap of a twig setting me on edge. I walked back to my car, constantly scanning the trees, ready to run. The road back to the main highway seemed longer than before, the dirt track now a series of obstacles in my panic state. As I reached the paved road, I exhaled, realizing I could finally leave the forest behind. The feeling of relief was immense. I drove without stopping, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly they hurt. By the time I reached the first gas station, I felt exhausted, drained, but safe. I reported what I had found at the cabin to the local authorities. The fresh footprints, the signs of someone trespassing. But by then, the cabin had likely been empty for hours, the intruder gone. I never went back to that area. The experience stayed with me for years, the way isolation can amplify fear, how the forest can hide someone watching you, and how quickly a quiet night can turn into a nightmare. I learned to always trust my instincts and prepare for the unexpected. Cabin trips, once a dream of solitude, became something I approached with caution, awareness, and never alone. Even now, whenever I hear the sound of footsteps behind me in the dark, I remember that night, the weight of silence, the shadows moving just out of reach, and the feeling that someone could be watching. I realized how fragile safety can be when you are truly alone, and how carefully you have to plan for it. The cabin was never just a building. It was a test of awareness, patience, and survival. And I survived, but it left a mark on me that never went away. I had been looking forward to this weekend for months, planning it down to the smallest detail. After the months of stress at work and the endless city noise, I decided I needed a break, a place where I could disconnect from everything. I wanted solitude, the kind you don't get anywhere near the city, and I thought a remote cabin in the mountains would be perfect. I didn't want anyone around, no distractions, no obligations, just the wilderness and me. I had rented a small cabin through a reliable listing online. It was isolated, off the main road by at least half a mile, and I liked the thought of being alone. I packed my car the night before I left, making sure I had everything I might need. Food, water, camping supplies, a first aid kit, extra blankets, a lantern, batteries, and my small stove. I even brought some wood, though the cabin had a fireplace. I was prepared to stay a few days, maybe a long weekend, alone with my thoughts. I liked being alone, I liked silence, and I thought it would be perfect. The drive itself was long. The closer I got to the mountains, the narrower the roads became. I had to dodge potholes, fallen branches, and patches of mud from recent rain. Eventually, the asphalt turned into gravel, and then into a dirt track that twisted and climbed steep hills, with dense trees pressing close on either side. There were no other cars, no houses, no signs of civilization. I felt a strange mix of excitement and unease as I drove. There was something about being completely alone in a place so far from anyone else that made the air feel different, heavier somehow. Finally, after what felt like hours, I saw the cabin. It was modest, made of dark wood, almost blending in with the surrounding forest. A small chimney jutted out from the roof, and a stack of firewood leaned against the side of the building. A porch ran along the front, with 2 old chairs that looked like they hadn't been used in years. There was no electricity, except for a small solar panel on the roof, which powered a couple of lights inside. I parked the car and stepped out. The air was cold, crisp, and smelled of pine and damp earth. Silence surrounded me. No birds, no wind, nothing. Just the occasional rustle of leaves somewhere deep in the forest. I felt a thrill as I carried my bags inside, locking the door behind me. The cabin was small but functional. There was a single room with a stove, a table, a chair, and a small couch. A bedroom was separated by a thin wooden wall, with a bed that looked soft enough. A tiny bathroom was tucked in the corner, with a cold water tap and a small shower. Everything was old but clean. I unpacked, stacking my food in the small cupboards, laying my clothes in the drawers, and lighting a fire in the fireplace to warm the cabin. The fire flickered, casting long shadows on the walls, and I felt that warm comfort settle over me as I finally sank into the couch with a cup of tea I had brought along. The first day passed quietly. I explored the area around the cabin, noting the dense trees, the slight incline that led to a small stream, and a narrow path that seemed to lead deeper into the forest. I gathered some kindling for the fireplace and stacked it neatly by the door. I took photos, walked a few hundred meters along the stream, and then returned. Nothing seemed out of place. I ate a simple dinner of canned beans warmed on the stove and went to bed early. The silence was profound, a living, breathing presence in the cabin. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful. The first night was strange. I slept lightly, waking occasionally at the slightest noise. Every rustle outside made my heart jump. I told myself it was just animals, squirrels, or birds perhaps, moving through the underbrush. I tried to ignore it. Around 2 in the morning, I woke to the sound of something heavy hitting the cabin's front door. My heart raced. I froze, listening. It happened again, a dull thud, followed by a dragging sound. I slowly reached for the small flashlight I kept by the bed and crept toward the door. Peering out the small window, I saw nothing. No shadows, no figures, just the dark woods. I checked the locks. Everything was fine. I stayed awake for hours, listening, but heard nothing more. Eventually, I drifted back to sleep, exhausted and tense. The next morning, I decided I would take a longer walk along the path I had noticed the previous day. I wanted to distract myself from the fear lingering from the night before. The forest was thick, and the path was overgrown, but I pressed on. Birds started to chirp, and the rustle of leaves seemed friendlier in the daylight. I found some interesting tracks on the dirt, probably deer, and I followed them for a while before deciding to turn back. The further I went, the denser and darker the forest became, and I realized how quickly the sun could be blocked by the thick canopy. I noted the time and made sure to head back before nightfall. When I returned to the cabin, I noticed something odd. The firewood I had neatly stacked yesterday had been disturbed. Some pieces were scattered, as if someone or something had been rifling through it. My stomach twisted. I double-checked the doors and windows. Everything was locked. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe a raccoon, maybe the wind, but there was no sign of a way for a small animal to have moved such heavy pieces of wood. I shrugged it off as my imagination and built another fire, making sure it burned brightly. I stayed close to it for the evening, cooking a simple pasta dinner and keeping my eyes on the darkened windows. The night after that was worse. Around midnight, I woke to the sound of footsteps outside, slow and deliberate, circling the cabin. My heart pounded, my stomach churned. I didn't make a sound, just lay flat, straining to hear. The footsteps stopped near the door, and I could hear the faint scraping of metal on wood. Someone was trying the lock. I froze, my mind racing through every possible scenario. The flashlight was on the table, within reach, along with a small hunting knife I kept in my bag. I debated my options. I could wait, hoping it was someone lost, or I could try to scare them off. The footsteps moved to the back, then stopped. Then silence. Hours passed before I dared to move. I checked the doors and windows. Nothing had been broken, but there were now muddy footprints on the wooden porch. They were human, adult-sized, and there was no denying it. Someone had been at my cabin, and I had been alone with them. The following morning, I realized I couldn't just sit there and wait. I decided to hike down the dirt road to the main road and check in with the local ranger station. I packed a bag with essentials and started down the steep, winding track. The forest was quiet again, deceptively calm, but my mind kept flashing back to the previous night. The sun was high, but shadows still fell heavily among the trees. I moved cautiously, aware that whoever had been at the cabin could still be nearby. The hike was longer than I expected, but eventually, I reached the main road, where I flagged down a passing car and explained my situation. The driver called the ranger station, and a ranger agreed to meet me back at the cabin with backup. Relief washed over me, though a part of me still felt raw anxiety at the thought of returning. When the ranger and a colleague arrived, I led them back to the cabin. They examined the area, noting the footprints and disturbed wood. They suggested that whoever had been there might still be hiding in the forest or could be monitoring the cabin. They advised me not to stay, and I agreed. I packed my remaining belongings quickly, grateful for their presence. The rangers stayed behind for a while, patrolling the surrounding area before eventually leaving me with their assurance that the area would be watched for the next few days. As I drove away from the cabin, leaving the dense forest behind, I felt a mixture of relief and lingering fear. The wilderness had been more dangerous than I anticipated, not because of animals or ghosts, but because of the very real possibility of encountering other humans with unknown intentions. I realized the solitude I had craved came with risks I hadn't fully considered. The experience left me with a deep respect for how unpredictable being truly alone in the wilderness could be. Back in the city, life returned to normal, but I never forgot that cabin. Weeks later, I looked into more secure cabins with fencing, alarms, or locations closer to ranger stations. I realized that enjoying the wilderness didn't have to mean complete isolation, and that safety and preparation were as important as adventure. The experience left me cautious but not deterred. I still wanted to be alone in nature, but I had learned to balance solitude with security. That trip stayed with me, a constant reminder that fear can be entirely realistic and still leave a lasting impression. I no longer romanticized isolation. Instead, I planned with care, making lists, checking supplies, and even researching the local population, animal activity, and weather patterns. When I finally went back to a cabin months later, I chose a place with surveillance cameras, a secure gate, and neighbors within a mile. The fear I had felt before returned only briefly as I approached the cabin, but it was replaced by a sense of control. The second trip was quiet, safe, and serene, exactly what I had wanted the first time. I felt a quiet triumph in knowing I could experience the wilderness fully, without the paralyzing fear of that first night. The lesson I carried from that experience was clear. Nature can be beautiful, peaceful, and restorative, but it demands respect. Isolation amplifies not only the serenity but also the risks, especially the risks posed by other people. Planning, preparation, and awareness are not just wise, they are essential. That first cabin taught me the importance of vigilance and the balance between solitude and safety. I never let my guard down again, and I never will. I had always thought that getting away from the noise of the city, the endless blaring horns, the constant chatter of people, and the pressing deadlines would calm something inside me that I didn't even fully understand. The idea of a cabin deep in the woods, far from everything and everyone, seemed like the perfect escape. I found one listed online, a small wooden structure nestled in a valley surrounded by thick forest. The pictures made it look cozy, almost quaint. A little porch with a rocking chair, a fireplace, a clear view of the surrounding trees. I booked it immediately, convinced I needed this solitude more than anything. The drive itself set the mood for what would become the strangest experience of my life. The road narrowed gradually, winding and twisting between hills so steep they almost seemed like cliffs. Trees pressed against the asphalt as if trying to reclaim it, their branches intertwining overhead and creating a tunnel of green and gold as the late autumn sun filtered through. The further I drove, the quieter it became. The distant hum of cars faded, replaced by the occasional call of a bird, the crunch of my tires over fallen leaves, and the low whisper of the wind through the pines. By the time I reached the last fork in the road, a barely noticeable gravel path leading to the cabin, I had the uneasy feeling that I was entering a different world entirely. When I finally saw the cabin, it was exactly like the pictures, but somehow smaller and more isolated than I had imagined. A thin wisp of smoke rose from the chimney, suggesting that the place had been recently used. Yet there was no car in the driveway, no sign of anyone. I parked and stepped out, breathing in the crisp air that smelled of damp earth, decaying leaves, and pine. The silence pressed against me in a way that was almost physical, making my ears ring slightly. I tried to shake off the tension and focus on the cabin itself. Inside, it was warm and smelled faintly of wood polish and old firewood. The living area had a simple couch, a small wooden table, and a fireplace with neatly stacked logs beside it. The kitchen was compact, with a small stove, a sink, and a few cupboards, all clean and seemingly ready for use. A narrow staircase led to a loft with a bed, and a small bathroom was tucked behind the kitchen. I set my bags down and walked slowly around, touching the surfaces, taking in the details. The wood felt smooth beneath my fingers, the floors creaked slightly under my weight, and the windows offered a view of the surrounding forest, where the light of the late afternoon sun made everything look golden. At first, everything felt perfect. I unpacked my things, set up a small area for reading, and made a fire in the fireplace. I sat by the window, listening to the wind rustling through the trees, feeling the kind of calm that comes from being completely alone. But as night fell, the quiet began to change. At first, it was subtle. A branch tapping against the window, the soft rustle of leaves. But then it became more pronounced. I could hear something moving outside, something heavier than the wind. The sound of feet crunching over leaves, slow and deliberate, coming closer and then fading, as if circling the cabin. I told myself it was probably a deer, or maybe a raccoon, but even as I tried to convince myself, a cold knot of fear formed in my stomach. I checked the doors and windows, making sure everything was locked. The cabin felt secure, solid, yet the feeling of being watched persisted. Every time I glanced toward the windows, shadows seemed to shift in ways that didn't match the movement of the trees. I kept the fire burning and tried to distract myself with a book, but every crack of a branch outside made me jump. At some point, the sky turned completely black, and the moon rose, casting pale light across the clearing. I could see shapes in the shadows, tall, thin shapes moving between the trees. I told myself again that it was my imagination, that the isolation and darkness were playing tricks on me. I tried to sleep, but the bed felt uncomfortable, too soft, and the floor beneath it creaked in the strange way old wooden cabins do. Around midnight, I woke to a sound that made my heart stop. A low, deliberate thump on the roof. Someone or something was up there. I froze, listening. Another thump, then another, each one spaced out like someone testing the wood for strength. My mind raced. It had to be an animal, but no animal that I knew could climb onto a roof and move around with such careful, heavy steps. The panic set in, cold and physical, and I realized that the fire in the fireplace had burned low. I grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen, trying to make my way downstairs without making too much noise, but my foot caught on the edge of the rug, and I stumbled. The sound echoed, loud and unnatural in the empty cabin. The thumping stopped. I had been planning this solo trip for months, preparing every detail carefully. The idea was simple. Spend a week in a remote cabin deep in the mountains, completely alone, away from everything and everyone. I thought it would be peaceful, a chance to reset, to disconnect from the constant noise of life. I had no illusions that it would be dangerous, at least not in the sense most people think. I was aware of the usual risks, wildlife, bad weather, getting lost, but I had been hiking and camping for years. I thought I knew how to handle it. That confidence would come back to haunt me. The cabin itself was about a 3-hour drive from the nearest town, up a narrow, winding dirt road that was barely maintained. It had been abandoned for a few years, but the owner had recently fixed it up, and the rent was cheap compared to other cabins in the area. When I arrived, the sun was already low, casting long shadows through the pine trees that crowded the path to the cabin. The air smelled like damp earth and fallen leaves. I parked my car and took a deep breath, trying to let the stress of the city slip away. The cabin was small but solid, made of rough timber with a pitched roof and a tiny porch. It had no electricity, but there was a wood stove inside and a small solar panel that powered a single lamp in the main room. That was all I needed. I spent the first hour unpacking, organizing my supplies, stacking firewood neatly near the stove. Everything had a place, and I took satisfaction in the orderliness of it. Outside, the forest was alive with sound. The rustle of leaves, birds calling to one another, the occasional snap of a twig somewhere in the distance. I felt safe, at least for the moment. I set up a small campfire outside, just in case I wanted to sit under the stars, but I mostly stayed inside. The cabin smelled faintly of old wood and smoke, comforting in a strange way. I lit the stove, the fire crackling and warming the room. I had brought books, some basic cooking supplies, and plenty of food. Everything was planned. The first night was quiet. I fell asleep easily, the kind of sleep that comes after a long drive and a day of organizing. But the second night, things began to feel different. It started subtly, with small noises outside. Something scraping against the cabin walls, branches tapping in a pattern that felt deliberate rather than random. I told myself it was the wind or a raccoon or a deer brushing against the porch. But then came the heavy thump, not once but twice, like someone had kicked the side of the cabin. My stomach dropped, but I reminded myself I was miles from the nearest road. No one should be here. I went to the window and peered out. The forest was dark, black as ink, the only light coming from the fire I had built outside. Nothing moved. I checked my locks, though they were nothing more than a basic latch, and tried to calm myself. I told myself I was imagining things, that my mind was playing tricks in the darkness. I went back to bed, but sleep didn't come as easily that night. Every sound felt amplified, the wind in the trees, the rustle of leaves, even the creak of the floorboards beneath me. I kept imagining someone moving outside, crouched in the shadows, watching. I had never felt truly alone like that before. The next day, I tried to distract myself. I explored the area around the cabin, making notes of trails I could follow, finding a small stream nearby for water. The forest looked peaceful in daylight, sun filtering through the branches, birds and squirrels moving about. I collected firewood, prepared meals, and settled into a rhythm. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every time I looked up from chopping wood or gathering water, I had the instinct to scan the tree line, to see someone there. There was no one. Still, my heart would race with each imagined movement, my eyes searching for shapes that weren't there. By the third night, things escalated. I had built a larger fire outside, thinking the light would deter anything or anyone that might be near. As I sat by the fire, I heard it again. Footsteps. This time I was certain. Slow, deliberate crunching through the underbrush. I froze. My mind raced through possibilities, all terrifying. Someone had to be out there. I grabbed the hatchet I had kept by the door, my pulse hammering. The steps stopped suddenly, as if whoever it was had sensed I was aware. Then I heard breathing, low and deliberate, just beyond the reach of the firelight. I wanted to run, to lock myself inside, but I didn't. I stayed perfectly still, waiting, listening. Eventually, the sounds faded, but not before leaving a deep, gnawing fear that I had never experienced before. I spent the rest of the night sitting on the floor near the door, hatchet in hand, watching the shadows flicker in the firelight. The following morning, I found something that made my stomach turn. Near the edge of the clearing, footprints in the mud, unmistakably human, leading from the forest toward the cabin and back again. They were large, heavy, deliberate. Someone had been circling my cabin while I slept. The thought that I had been completely unaware, that someone could have been so close without my noticing, made me feel vulnerable in a way I had never imagined. My mind raced with scenarios. A robber, a local who didn't like intruders, a homeless person hiding in the forest. But none of that mattered. I was alone, completely unprotected, and miles from help. I spent the entire day reinforcing the cabin's windows, nailing boards across weak spots, making it as secure as I could with what I had. I stood frozen, listening. Outside, I thought I heard whispers. Not words, just the faint rustling of voices carried by the wind. My rational mind told me it was impossible, that the wind and the trees made strange sounds in the night, but the fear was impossible to ignore. I considered leaving, getting into my car, and driving back the way I came, but the road was long and narrow, and I didn't want to face it in the dark. I stayed put, moving quietly to the window and peering out. The clearing was empty, but I could see the footprints in the dirt around the cabin. Large, uneven prints, some close to the windows. My stomach dropped. They weren't animal prints. They were human. The next hours were a blur of fear and vigilance. I stayed near the fire, flashlight in hand, listening to every sound. Every branch snapping, every leaf rustle made me jump. I felt the cabin walls pressing in, the darkness outside thickening, almost tangible. At one point, I thought I saw movement in the corner of my eye, a shadow passing by the doorway. I froze, holding my breath, straining to see. Nothing, but the sense of being watched never left. By dawn, exhaustion took over. I fell into a fitful, shallow sleep, only to wake when the first light of morning spilled into the cabin. The sun made the forest look almost beautiful again, the shadows retreating, the warmth slowly filling the room. I moved cautiously to the windows, expecting to see signs of the previous night's intruder. The clearing was empty, the footprints gone, as if erased by some invisible hand. Relief washed over me, but it was weak and fragile. I decided to leave immediately. I packed my things, made sure everything was off, and stepped outside. The forest was quiet, the kind of quiet that seemed unreal after a night like that. I walked to my car, checking behind me constantly, half expecting to see someone or something following. When I finally got in and started the engine, the relief was overwhelming. The narrow road twisted and turned as I drove back towards civilization. Every shadow along the roadside made me tense. Every tree seemed to lean closer, but nothing followed. I didn't stop for a long time. The city lights eventually appeared, and with them came the noise and chaos I had been trying to escape. Oddly, I was grateful for it. The constant hum of life, the cars, the people. It was reassuring, grounding, proof that I was safe. When I finally returned to my apartment, I locked the door behind me and sat on the couch, staring at the walls, still feeling the ghost of fear from the cabin pressing against my chest. In the following days, I thought about going back, trying to rationalize the experience. Maybe someone had been playing a prank. Maybe it was a squatter's hideout I hadn't known about. But I couldn't shake the memory of the footprints, the deliberate thumping on the roof, the feeling of being watched all night. It left a mark on me that wouldn't fade easily. I eventually decided never to return. I sold the cabin reservation and told myself I'd stick to places where I could hear people, where there was a sense of safety in numbers. Years later, I learned through news reports that a small group of criminals had been living in the forests not far from that area, breaking into cabins and hiding from authorities. They were never caught in my specific region, but others had experienced similar encounters. Empty cabins that weren't so empty, sounds in the night that weren't imagined. Understanding that it had been real, and not just a trick of fear, brought an odd sense of closure. I realized that some of the isolation we seek isn't always safe, and that the forest, beautiful as it may be, can hide dangers that no amount of preparation can fully account for. I never returned to a remote cabin after that, but I learned something important about fear, about vigilance, and about the fragile line between solitude and danger. The memory of that night stayed with me, not like a haunting, but like a warning. Beauty in isolation can hide something darker than you expect, and sometimes the most terrifying things aren't supernatural. They are simply real, deliberate, and very close to you. That night, I barely slept. Every creak of the cabin, every gust of wind, set my heart racing. I was hyper-aware of every sound. Around midnight, I heard it again. Footsteps, slow and heavy, circling the cabin. This time, I didn't wait. I opened the door and shouted, swinging my hatchet. There was no one there, just footprints in the mud, circling like before, then disappearing into the forest. I realized at that moment that I was dealing with someone who knew how to move quietly, someone experienced, someone who might be waiting for me to make a mistake. Fear had taken root in my chest. It wasn't just about being alone anymore. It was about survival. The next day, I decided I couldn't stay. The plan had been simple, and now it felt naive. I packed quickly, moving through the cabin like a storm, grabbing everything that could be carried. I left food and books behind. As I loaded my car, I kept scanning the treeline. Every shadow made me flinch. The feeling of being watched never left. I started the car, but the engine wouldn't turn over. Panic rose like bile in my throat. I tried again, then again. Nothing. I stepped out, checking under the hood, my hands shaking. That's when I saw him, or rather, the outline of him, a figure standing still in the trees at the edge of the clearing. I couldn't make out details, just a human shape. My pulse surged. I slammed the hood, jumped in the driver's seat, and tried again. The engine roared to life. I didn't look back. I floored it down the dirt road, my headlights cutting through the darkness, heart racing. Behind me, in the distance, I thought I saw movement, but I didn't stop to check. I drove all night, through the mountains, keeping my eyes on the road, barely slowing for anything. I didn't stop until I reached a small town with a gas station. I parked, trembling, feeling a strange mix of relief and lingering fear. I reported the incident to the local sheriff, explaining everything as best I could, but by the time they arrived, the forest was empty. They took my statement seriously, noted the footprints, and even promised to patrol the area more frequently. But the sense of danger, the feeling of being hunted, didn't leave me immediately. I stayed in town for a few days, resting, trying to calm myself. The cabin was supposed to be a retreat, a place to recharge. Instead, it had shown me just how vulnerable I could be, how quickly comfort could turn into fear. Weeks later, I returned with a friend, someone who had experience in remote areas. We walked the area around the cabin together, marking footprints, checking for signs of anyone living secretly in the forest. Everything had vanished. No footprints, no signs of habitation, nothing. It was as if whoever had been there had melted into the woods, leaving no trace. The cabin itself felt different with company. I could see it now as a safe place with enough preparation and backup, but alone it had been terrifying. That experience stayed with me for months, shaping the way I approach solitude and wilderness trips. I learned that fear isn't always about what's supernatural or imagined. It's about the unknown, the vulnerability, the realization that there are people in the world who operate outside your awareness and can appear at any moment. Eventually, I returned to the cabin once more, properly prepared, this time with 2 other friends and a plan for every emergency. We reinforced the cabin, checked all approaches, and stayed together. I even brought a satellite phone, something I should have done from the beginning. It was still remote, still quiet, but without the constant sense of being hunted, it was peaceful again. The forest looked the same. The same shadows, the same wind through the trees, but I wasn't alone. That made all the difference. I cooked meals over the wood stove, gathered water from the stream, explored the trails, and slept soundly at night. I even laughed at myself, remembering the terror of my first attempt. I realized that fear had made every sound sharper, every shadow darker, and every moment feel longer. But preparation, company, and awareness had transformed the experience. What had been a nightmare alone became a test I could enjoy and survive. That cabin trip, that first terrifying night, taught me something about myself. It taught me the limits of my confidence and the value of vigilance. I understood that fear is real, grounded in real threats, and that being alone in the wilderness is not a game. I also learned that preparation is everything, and that facing fear, while uncomfortable and exhausting, can lead to clarity. By the end of my second, properly planned trip, I left the forest not only unharmed, but with a profound sense of accomplishment and a renewed respect for both nature and human unpredictability. I knew I would return one day, but never alone and never unprepared. The forest had taught me a lesson in fear, survival, and respect, one that stayed with me long after I drove away for good. I had been planning this trip for months, thinking I needed a break from everything. My work, the city, even people. I found a small cabin online, tucked away in the mountains, reachable only by a narrow dirt road that twisted through dense woods. The pictures showed a simple wooden structure, with a stone fireplace and a deck that overlooked a steep valley. The idea of being completely alone, surrounded by trees, felt perfect. I didn't know then how wrong that assumption would turn out. The drive up was longer than I expected. The car struggled on the rocky path, and by the time I reached the cabin, the sun was just dipping below the horizon, leaving a deep orange glow in the sky. The air smelled different here, sharp and cold, with the scent of pine and damp earth. I parked the car near the cabin and walked up the narrow steps. The door was unlocked, as the owner had promised in the instructions. Inside, the cabin was simple and clean. There was a small kitchen, a loft with a bed, and a wood stove. The walls were rough timber, and the floor creaked slightly under my weight. I spent the first hour just unpacking and exploring. I stacked firewood next to the stove, checked that the windows closed properly, and made a quick fire to warm the place up. Outside, the sky had darkened, and shadows spread across the forest like a living thing. From inside, I could hear the wind moving through the trees, the occasional snap of a branch. It was normal, I told myself, just nature. By nightfall, the forest became a different place. The rustling of leaves and distant animal sounds seemed louder, sharper. I sat by the window, watching as darkness swallowed the valley. There was no moon, only a faint starlight, barely illuminating the shapes of trees and rocks. I realized I could not see very far at all, not past the edge of the cabin's small clearing. That was when I first heard it, a distant footstep crunching on gravel or leaves. It stopped, and then the sound moved slowly along the edge of the clearing, circling the cabin. My heart rate spiked. I told myself it was an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon. But then the sound paused, and I realized it had stopped just outside the window I was looking through. I stayed perfectly still. The darkness pressed in, and my mind raced. The air suddenly felt heavier. I checked the locks again, though I had already done so. Every instinct in my body told me to get out, but I had no idea how far the nearest town was, or if I could even make it in the dark. The footsteps started again, moving around the cabin, slow and deliberate, not like an animal. My stomach churned, and I forced myself to stay calm. I remembered the small axe by the fireplace and kept it in reach. The night dragged on. Every sound seemed amplified. The creak of the cabin, the wind through the pines, small rocks falling somewhere in the distance. Occasionally, the footsteps returned, always around the perimeter, never stopping for long. I didn't sleep that night. I just sat in the loft, listening, waiting for the sunrise. When the first light came through the window, the footsteps were gone, but I didn't feel safe. The next day, I decided I needed to leave, but the road down was blocked by fallen branches from a small landslide that had happened overnight. The cabin was trapped by mud and rocks. I spent hours clearing the smaller debris with the shovel I had brought, but the larger logs were impossible to move alone. I realized I might be stuck for a day or two. That night, the footsteps returned. This time, they were accompanied by something else. Soft tapping at the windows, a scratch here and there along the wooden walls. I checked all the locks again. I knew it was someone outside. My heart pounded like a drum. I sat in the loft with the axe, listening. The sound didn't stop. Whoever it was, they were patient. I could feel their presence just beyond the edges of the cabin. I thought about calling the police, but the cell signal was weak, barely enough to send a text. I considered hiking down the road to find help, but the forest was thick, and the debris from the landslide made travel dangerous. I had no choice but to wait it out. Hours passed. The tapping and scratching became rhythmic, almost taunting. At one point, I heard a low whistle, barely audible, coming from the woods. It was a sound meant to draw attention, to unsettle me. My body ached, and my mind raced with possibilities. Who was out there? What did they want? I realized that this was not random. Someone had been watching me, knowing I would be alone. The thought was unbearable. As dawn approached, the person or people left. I couldn't tell if they had been just outside or if they had been moving around all night. The first rays of sun were a relief, but I knew I couldn't stay another night. I spent the next few hours inspecting the area around the cabin. I found footprints in the mud, large and heavy, circling the cabin and leading into the woods. Some prints looked fresh, others older. Whoever had been here knew the terrain, the cabin, and probably had planned this. I decided to make a run for it. I packed quickly, grabbed the axe, and stepped out, scanning the woods. Every sound made me jump. I chose a path slightly off the main road, hoping to move faster without being seen. It was slow going. I stumbled over roots, slipped in mud, but I kept moving. Hours passed, and I finally reached a stretch of road I recognized. I ran to the nearest house I could see in the valley, pounding on the door until someone answered. They called the sheriff immediately. When the deputies came with me back to the cabin, the place looked normal. No signs of forced entry, no obvious damage. But the footprints were still there, fading into the woods. They told me it was likely someone had been trespassing, maybe watching cabins in the area. The deputies checked the surrounding forest for hours but found nothing. They assured me it wasn't uncommon for isolated cabins to be targeted, and that staying vigilant was the only way to protect myself. I didn't go back to that cabin. The owner refunded my money, and I never felt the same about being alone in the woods again. I still remember the sound of those footsteps circling, the tapping on the walls, the way the darkness felt alive. It wasn't supernatural, but it was real. It was fear, and it taught me that isolation is a dangerous thing, especially when someone else knows exactly where you are. In the weeks that followed, I took precautions, installed security cameras at home, avoided remote cabins, and kept my phone fully charged and reachable at all times. The experience left a mark. I realized how vulnerable I had been, trusting the silence of nature as if it could protect me. I learned that danger doesn't need ghosts. It doesn't need legends. Sometimes, it's just people watching, waiting, and ready to take advantage of your solitude. Even now, years later, I think about that night whenever I hear a branch snap outside, or when I drive down a lonely road. My hands still tighten around the steering wheel, and my eyes scan the woods. I survived, yes, and I made it out alive, but I will never forget the weight of that night, the slow, patient steps of someone circling my cabin, and the silence that screamed danger louder than any ghost ever could. That memory stays with me, a constant reminder that some threats are terrifying because they are real. I had been planning this trip for months, a solo retreat into the backwoods to clear my head and get away from everything. The city had become suffocating, full of noise, deadlines, and the constant feeling of being trapped. I wanted nothing more than isolation, a quiet cabin somewhere far from civilization, surrounded by nothing but trees and the occasional sound of wildlife. I found a small cabin for rent deep in a national forest, advertised as remote, rustic, and completely off-grid. The reviews were sparse but glowing, though I noticed a few mentions of limited cell service and difficulty accessing the place if the weather turned bad. I didn't mind. I wanted hard, old-fashioned isolation. The drive out was long. I took a route that wound through narrow roads lined with towering pines and oaks. The closer I got to the forest, the quieter the world became. The usual hum of cars faded, replaced by the occasional rustle of birds and the distant sound of a stream. When I finally turned onto the dirt road that led to the cabin, I realized how truly remote this place was. The road had potholes that seemed eager to swallow tires whole, patches of gravel and mud that had hardened into rough, uneven ground. I drove slowly, craning my neck to make sure I wouldn't run into anything. The air thick with the scent of pine and wet earth. The cabin itself was smaller than I expected. It was a simple log structure, weathered and rough, with a slanted roof and a small porch out front. The windows were grimy but intact, and a thin wisp of smoke curled faintly from a metal chimney, though I had no idea if anyone had been there recently. The door creaked loudly when I opened it, revealing a dim, empty interior. There was a main room with a small kitchen area, a wood stove, a table, a couple of chairs, and a ladder that led to a loft where a mattress sat. Everything inside smelled faintly of damp wood and dust, the kind of smell that immediately tells you the place had been untouched for months. I set down my bag and walked around slowly, inspecting. The floors were rough, the walls uneven, the roof thick with shadows. Outside, the trees pressed close to the cabin, their branches scratching lightly against the walls as the wind moved through them. I found a stack of firewood beside the cabin, split neatly, and a small bucket of water from a nearby stream. There was no running water or electricity, but I had expected that. I had packed a camping stove, lanterns, and enough food to last several days. The first night came fast. Darkness fell earlier than I expected, thick and absolute. There were no streetlights, no distant houses, nothing but the silhouettes of trees against a moonless sky. I lit the stove and boiled water for a cup of coffee, the steam fogging up the single window. The wind rustled outside, and I could hear the creak of trees bending, the occasional snapping of a distant branch. I ate quietly, feeling the isolation settle in. The silence was total, broken only by the occasional sounds of wildlife. A hoot of an owl, the skittering of small creatures in the underbrush, the far-off howl of a coyote. I went to bed early, the mattress firm and lumpy, the loft low and claustrophobic. I fell asleep quickly, but not deeply. Every sound outside made me tense, every brush against the walls or roof sending my heart rate up. Around 3 in the morning, I woke to a faint tapping sound, irregular and soft, coming from the direction of the porch. My first thought was a branch hitting the cabin, but the rhythm was deliberate, uneven, like someone testing the door. I held my breath, listening. The sound stopped as abruptly as it started. I lay awake for hours, straining to hear anything else. The wind picked up, whistling through the trees, masking everything else, and eventually, exhaustion dragged me into a shallow sleep. The next morning, I discovered something that unsettled me. A series of footprints, large and heavy, had appeared in the soft mud around the cabin, leading from the edge of the woods toward the porch and then circling back. They were human, not animal, and they were fresh. I hadn't noticed anyone nearby when I arrived, and no one else was supposed to be in this part of the forest. I felt a sharp twist of fear in my stomach. Maybe someone was camping nearby. Maybe someone had been watching the cabin. My rational mind tried to calm me. I was deep in the woods. The nearest road was miles away. It could be a hunter, or someone else renting a cabin far off. But the unease lingered. I spent the day outside, chopping wood, clearing some brush around the cabin, trying to convince myself that I was safe. Still, every sound seemed amplified, every shadow suspicious. By mid-afternoon, I had seen a figure moving among the trees at the edge of my vision. Not clearly, just a vague shape that disappeared when I looked directly at it. I kept moving, keeping busy, but the sense of being watched never left me. Night came again, darker than before. I lit a fire in the stove and ate quickly, my movements sharp and tense. The wind had died down, leaving the forest eerily quiet. Around 10 o'clock, the tapping returned. Louder this time, not at the porch but at the window. I froze. The sound was deliberate, heavy. I tried to calm myself, telling myself it was probably just a branch or a piece of debris hitting the glass, but my heart was hammering. I grabbed the small hatchet I had brought for firewood, holding it tightly. The tapping continued in uneven intervals, then stopped suddenly. I held my breath, waiting. The silence pressed down on me, thicker than the darkness. Around midnight, I heard another sound. A low, dragging noise, like someone moving heavily across the forest floor, approaching the cabin. It wasn't fast, but it was steady. I climbed the loft ladder quietly, trying not to make a sound. From the small window up there, I could see nothing but black. The sound continued for what felt like hours, moving around the perimeter of the cabin. I stayed still, gripping the hatchet, listening to my own breathing. Eventually, it stopped. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The next morning, I inspected the area again. More footprints, larger this time, circling the cabin, moving back and forth. Something had been out there around the cabin during the night. I realized that I was no longer alone in the forest, and whatever had been watching me was not going away. I packed lightly, ready to leave, but when I tried to start the car, the engine refused to turn over. I cursed under my breath, feeling the panic rise. My phone had no signal. The nearest road was miles away. I was stuck. I spent the day clearing a path to the main road, trying to make a line through the trees to get help. It was slow going, every step exhausting, but I kept at it. By evening, I had carved a narrow trail that I hoped would lead to civilization. I stayed near the cabin, keeping a fire going to signal anyone who might come by. The night was long, filled with every conceivable sound. Branches snapping, leaves rustling, the occasional low growl of an animal I couldn't see. I stayed awake, clutching the hatchet, my eyes wide, scanning the darkness. The third day, I decided to leave no matter what. I packed quickly, leaving behind most of my supplies, taking only what I could carry. As I moved toward the car, I thought I saw a figure between the trees, standing perfectly still, watching me. I ran, heart hammering, and the figure disappeared. The car started this time, thankfully, and I drove slowly down the rough dirt road, constantly checking the shadows along the edges of the trees. I didn't stop until I reached a paved road, and even then I kept moving, glancing in the rearview mirror. When I finally reached the nearest town, I went to the police. I told them about the footprints, the noises, the figure I had seen. They were skeptical but agreed to check the area. I never went back to that forest. The cabin remained rented, the listing still active online, but I couldn't bring myself to think about returning. I moved back into the city, taking the crowded streets and the constant noise with relief. The forest, once a place I longed for, became a memory that made my skin crawl whenever I thought of it. Months later, I learned that a man had been living illegally in the forest not far from the cabin, a drifter who had been hiding from authorities. He had been spotted by hikers several times but always stayed hidden. I realized then that the nights I spent in that cabin, the sounds I had heard, and the feeling of being watched were real, not imagined. The isolation I had sought had turned into a test of endurance, fear, and survival. I understood why the cabin reviews had been sparse. People never mentioned that the forest was not empty, that someone else could be there, just out of sight. I never returned to the forest. I never stayed alone in a remote cabin again. I still think about that experience. The total silence of the woods, the shadows pressing close, the sounds of someone unseen moving around the cabin. I think about how careful I was, how alert, and yet how vulnerable I truly was. Changed me, I learned the weight of true isolation, the reality of fear, and the fragile boundary between safety and exposure. The city, with all its noise and chaos, suddenly seemed like the safest place in the world. And I never took that safety for granted again. I had been planning this solo cabin trip for months, ever since I first found the listing online. It was a small, isolated cabin tucked deep in the forest of northern Maine, far away from any town or even minor roads. The pictures showed a modest wooden structure, a little run-down but charming, with a creek running beside it and thick trees surrounding it on all sides. It promised the kind of solitude I craved. I wanted to disconnect completely, spend a week alone with nothing but nature and my own thoughts. I had brought everything I thought I might need: food, water, camping gear, a first aid kit, batteries, and extra blankets. I wanted to be prepared for anything, though I never imagined the extent to which anything could stretch. The drive to the cabin had been long and winding. Most of the roads were dirt or gravel, and at times I had to slow to barely 10 miles per hour to avoid large rocks or deep ruts. The GPS signal was spotty at best. The last half hour of driving was guided only by a fading map I had printed out. Eventually, I found a narrow path leading off the main road, almost hidden by overgrown brush. The path twisted between dense trees, and the sunlight barely reached the ground through the canopy. It felt like entering a different world, one untouched by people for decades. When I finally saw the cabin through the trees, relief and excitement washed over me. The building looked exactly like it did in the pictures, with its dark, weathered wood blending seamlessly into the forest around it. The creek beside it murmured softly, a peaceful sound that I imagined would lull me to sleep every night. I parked my car on the small clearing near the cabin and unloaded my supplies. The air smelled of damp earth and pine, a scent I had always loved but rarely experienced so intensely in the city. As I stepped inside, the smell of old wood and faint mildew greeted me. The cabin was sparsely furnished. There was a small kitchen with a wood-burning stove, a table, a few chairs, a bed in one corner with a thin mattress, and some shelves with old, dusty books. The windows were dirty, letting in only slivers of light, but it didn't matter. The isolation felt perfect. I unpacked my things and stacked firewood beside the stove. I wanted to make sure I could start a fire when it got dark. I had learned that in places like this, fire wasn't just for warmth or cooking. It was a lifeline. The first evening passed quietly. I collected water from the creek, filtered it, and cooked a simple meal on the stove. The woods were full of sounds I didn't recognize at first. The distant howl of a coyote, the rustle of small animals through the underbrush, the creak of trees in the wind. I had expected silence, but it was a living silence, alive with nature. I lit a fire, settled onto the bed with a blanket wrapped around me, and fell asleep listening to the creak and the whisper of the wind. The next morning, I woke early to the sound of birds and the gentle sunlight filtering through the dirty windows. I had planned to spend the day hiking around the area, exploring the forest, and maybe taking some photos. I packed a small day bag with water, snacks, and a compass and headed out. The forest was denser than I expected. The trees were tall and close together, and underbrush tangled at every step. I moved slowly, careful not to trip over roots or sink into moss-covered ground. Occasionally, I would see signs of wildlife. Tracks in the mud, claw marks on trees, even the occasional scat. It made me feel like I was not the only one here, which was both thrilling and unsettling. Hours passed as I wandered deeper into the forest, noting landmarks and taking photographs. I realized at some point that I had walked farther than I intended. The creek I had been following disappeared, replaced by dense forest and uneven terrain. I had a rough idea of the cabin's direction, but the forest was disorienting. Every tree looked the same and every slope felt identical. The sun was beginning to lower in the sky, and I knew I needed to turn back soon. I retraced my steps carefully, but the forest seemed to have shifted. Landmarks I thought I remembered were gone or obscured. Anxiety began to creep in. I started calling out, not expecting anyone to hear me, just hoping to hear my own voice as a guide. It echoed oddly among the trees and fell silent. The forest felt vast, almost endless. By the time I stumbled back onto the path that led to the cabin, the sky was darkening. Shadows stretched long across the ground, and the forest became a web of shapes and movement. I quickened my pace, grateful to see the faint outline of the cabin through the trees. Relief flooded me as I reached it, but it was short-lived. The front door, which I had locked before leaving, was slightly ajar. My stomach dropped. I could see that the latch had been forced. It hung loose, the wood around it splintered. I froze, listening. The wind had shifted, and the usual sounds of the forest were gone, replaced by an unnatural silence. I felt my heart hammering in my chest. The idea that someone could have been in my cabin while I was gone terrified me. The nearest road was miles away. I couldn't just drive to safety. My phone had no signal. I had to stay calm. I carefully entered the cabin, scanning every corner. Nothing seemed touched except the door. My supplies were untouched, my bag still where I had left it. There was no sign of someone hiding inside, but the broken latch meant I couldn't be sure. I reinforced the door as best I could, wedging a chair under the handle. My mind raced through every possible scenario. Was it a local thief? Someone who had been watching me? Or just an animal that had managed to push the door open? I considered going outside to look for tracks, but decided against it. The darkness was too thick, and I didn't want to expose myself. I stayed near the stove where I had some light and warmth and tried to calm down. Sleep was impossible. I lay on the bed, wrapped in my blanket, listening. Every crack of a branch outside, every shift of leaves, made me flinch. I checked the windows repeatedly, trying to see beyond the faint glow of the fire. I had brought a flashlight, but I didn't want to go outside unless absolutely necessary. Hours passed, though I could not tell how many. The forest seemed to press against the cabin walls, shadows moving in ways that made no sense. I had a sense that I was being watched, though I could see nothing. I forced myself to breathe slowly, telling myself that I had simply imagined it. Still, the fear lingered, gnawing at the edges of my mind. The next morning, I ventured outside cautiously. The forest looked normal in the daylight, but as I inspected the ground around the cabin, I saw tracks. Not animal tracks, human footprints, partially muddied, leading from the tree line to the cabin door and back into the forest. They were fresh, probably from last night. My heart sank. I realized that someone had been here, maybe watching me for hours, maybe longer. I felt exposed and vulnerable in a way I had never felt before. The thought of sleeping another night in the cabin, with the knowledge that someone had entered it while I slept, filled me with dread. I needed a plan. I spent the day preparing. I reinforced the door with logs, stacked extra firewood against the entrance, and made a makeshift alarm system with cans and string around the cabin. I also moved some of my supplies to higher shelves out of reach. I stayed alert, walking the perimeter every hour, trying to learn the patterns of the forest. Every sound made me jump. Every shadow felt like a person watching. I considered leaving, but the nearest town was a 4-hour hike through dense forest. I had no signal to call for help, and I couldn't risk being caught outside. I had to wait it out. That night, I barely slept, curled on the bed with the fire burning low. I heard noises outside, branches snapping, leaves rustling, faint scraping sounds, but nothing came close enough to confirm a presence. I stayed still, listening, heart racing, until the first light of dawn. The relief I felt when the sun rose was almost physical. With daylight came clarity. I ventured outside and walked cautiously through the clearing. I noticed more footprints, leading away from the cabin into the deeper forest. They didn't return. Whoever had been there had left. I couldn't tell if they were still nearby, but at least for now they were gone. Over the next few days, I stayed vigilant but started to reclaim some calm. I walked the surrounding area, marking landmarks, building makeshift barriers at the cabin, and ensuring I had access to fresh water and firewood. I learned to anticipate sounds and recognize which were harmless and which could signal danger. I didn't feel entirely safe, but I felt prepared. I realized that fear could paralyze me if I let it, but preparedness and observation gave me control. On the last morning of my trip, I packed my supplies carefully and double-checked the cabin, making sure nothing was left behind. I took one final look around, appreciating the isolation, the quiet, and the beauty of the forest, even after the fear I had felt. I hiked back to the main road, following the map carefully. The sun was high, the forest alive with sound, and I felt a sense of accomplishment. I had survived, not because of luck, but because I had stayed aware, calm, and prepared. The cabin had been scary, the fear real, but in the end, I had faced it and left stronger, with a deep respect for the wilderness and the unknown. Driving away, I looked back once at the tree line. The cabin was barely visible now, swallowed by the forest. The fear lingered, a memory I knew would never fully leave me, but it was tempered by pride and relief. I had confronted something primal and come through it, and I knew that if I returned someday, I would do so with even more respect, awareness, and preparation. The forest didn't care about me, but I had learned to care about myself within it, and that made all the difference. I had been planning this trip for months, carefully plotting every detail. I needed the solitude, the quiet, the chance to escape from everything that pressed down on me in the city. The cabin was tucked deep in the forest, far from any road, far from any other people. When I finally drove up the dirt track that led to it, I could feel a sense of isolation settle over me like a heavy coat. The car rattled along the uneven path, rocks crunching under the tires, branches scraping against the sides. Every mile into the forest, the hum of the city faded further until it was gone completely, leaving only the wind through the pines and the distant cawing of birds. The cabin itself was small, built entirely of dark, weathered timber. Its roof was shingled with thick wood that had darkened with age, and the windows, small and square, reflected the sky in cold, unwelcoming rectangles. There was a porch just a few steps high, with a handrail that creaked when I leaned on it. I stepped out of the car and felt the cold bite of early autumn. The air was dry and crisp, carrying the smell of earth, pine, and rotting leaves. I opened the door and stepped inside. The interior was musty, the smell of old wood and damp hanging in the air. Dust motes danced in the shafts of sunlight that broke through the grimy windows. There was a small kitchen on one side, a narrow hallway leading to 2 bedrooms, and a living space with a fireplace that had not been used in a long time. The floorboards creaked beneath my feet, each step sounding impossibly loud in the stillness. I set down my bag and took a slow, deliberate walk through the cabin, familiarizing myself with every corner. The quiet was immediate and overwhelming. There were no sounds except for the occasional groan of the wooden structure settling, the occasional rustle from outside, and my own breathing, which suddenly seemed much too loud. I decided to explore the area around the cabin. There was a small clearing, maybe 20 meters across, bordered on all sides by thick pines. Beyond the trees, I could see the slope of the hill drop away, the forest stretching endlessly into the distance. There was a narrow trail leading downhill, almost hidden under the leaves and fallen branches. I traced it for a few hundred meters until it disappeared completely under dense undergrowth. The forest was alive, not with the playful sounds of nature I had imagined, but with small, constant movements. The snap of a twig, the rustle of leaves, the distant drumming of a woodpecker. Each sound made my chest tighten, a reminder that I was entirely alone. That first night, I slept uneasily. The cabin groaned as the wind picked up, whistling through cracks in the walls. At times, it sounded almost like footsteps outside, but each time I went to the window, there was nothing. The isolation weighed on me, and every shadow seemed to stretch unnaturally in the dim light of my small lantern. I tried to calm myself with practical thoughts. The forest was full of animals, nothing more. But even knowing that, my mind kept filling the quiet with imagined shapes and sounds, convincing me that something was moving in the shadows. The next day, I decided to get water from a small stream I had noticed while walking around. The path down was steeper than it looked, and the undergrowth scratched at my legs and hands. I reached the stream, a narrow trickle running over smooth stones, and filled my bottle. As I was turning back, I noticed footprints in the mud, barely visible, but definitely human. My stomach dropped. They were fresh. Someone had been here recently, though there was no sign of anyone around. I scanned the trees, heart hammering, but all I saw were the trunks and shadows. I shook my head, trying to dismiss the thought, but I felt a prickling at the back of my neck, the unmistakable feeling that I was being watched. Returning to the cabin, I found the door slightly ajar. I was certain I had locked it. My pulse jumped into my throat. I checked every lock, every window, the latch on the back door. Everything was intact, nothing disturbed. Still, I could not shake the feeling that someone had been inside. That night, sleep did not come. I sat in the corner of the living space, watching the shadows move with my lantern, listening to the wind, straining to catch every sound outside. The shadows seemed to lengthen with the night, curling around the corners of the room, pressing close. On the third day, I decided to check the trail I had seen leading into the forest. I had packed my backpack with essentials: a small knife, a flashlight, water, a first aid kit. The trail was narrow and overgrown, winding downward into the forest like a ribbon of darkness. As I walked, I noticed more footprints, human and animal. Some were fresh, some older. They crisscrossed the trail, leading in all directions. I tried to ignore them, telling myself the forest was used by hikers or hunters. But then I found something that made my blood run cold. Discarded food wrappers, a torn piece of clothing, and a small, empty bottle of alcohol lying in the dirt. It was obvious someone had been here recently, and they had left in a hurry. I returned to the cabin as the sun was setting, the sky turning a deep orange that quickly gave way to purple. The forest became darker and more threatening with every passing minute. By the time I reached the clearing, the last rays of sun were gone, leaving only the cold gray of twilight. I felt a sense of panic rise in me as I entered the cabin. The door, once again, was slightly open. My hands shook as I bolted it and checked the locks. I could not explain it. I had been careful, cautious, alone in the forest, and yet someone or something was near. That night, the wind picked up in earnest. The cabin shivered under its force. I could hear branches snapping outside, and every small noise set my nerves on fire. I spent hours sitting on the floor near the fireplace, listening to the forest, trying to convince myself that it was just animals, that the wind was just the wind. But then I heard a sound that made my stomach seize. Slow, deliberate footsteps circling the cabin. Not fast, not rushed, but heavy, measured. I could hear them on the porch, pacing back and forth. I wanted to hide, but there was nowhere to go. I could not escape. The forest was too thick, and my car was parked too far away. The night felt endless. I held the knife in my hand, my fingers tight around the handle, every muscle in my body tense. The footsteps continued until the early hours of the morning, then stopped suddenly, leaving an unbearable silence. I did not sleep. I stayed awake, listening, waiting. When morning came, the first light revealed nothing unusual outside. No footprints, no signs of anyone passing through. It was as though the night had been a dream, except for the terror etched into my mind. In the following days, I tried to keep busy. I gathered firewood, cleaned the cabin, explored the forest cautiously. I left small traps and markers along the paths to see if anyone passed while I was away. The forest was oppressive, every tree a potential hiding place, every shadow a possible threat. I discovered more signs that someone had been there. More footprints, broken branches, a knife embedded in a tree near the cabin. Whoever it was, they knew the area well, moving silently, watching without being seen. By the fifth day, I realized I could not stay any longer. The fear had become all-consuming. The isolation, the unknown presence, the constant tension. It had worn me down. I decided to leave, but the thought of walking out through the forest, potentially being followed, terrified me. I spent hours planning my exit. I would wait until the middle of the night when it was dark and move quietly, avoiding the paths I knew someone had used. I packed my belongings, double-checked my supplies, and waited until the sky was black. When I left, the forest seemed impossibly quiet. Every sound of my movement felt magnified. I took care to avoid footprints, moving slowly, deliberately. My heart pounded as I descended the hill toward the dirt road, every rustle of leaves making me freeze. I felt eyes on me, the sensation of being tracked without seeing the watcher. The road appeared in the distance, a pale strip cutting through the darkness. Relief surged through me. I ran the last few meters, not caring about the noise, not caring about anything but reaching safety. When I finally reached my car, I froze for a moment, half expecting someone to appear in the darkness. No one was there. I fumbled with the keys, started the engine, and drove away as fast as I could, the tires throwing dirt and leaves behind. The forest receded behind me, and with every mile, the tension in my body eased slightly. I did not look back. I did not stop until the city lights appeared on the horizon, a sign of civilization, of safety, of people. I never returned to that cabin. Weeks later, I heard that a hunter had found a makeshift campsite in the woods near where I had been. Empty bottles, torn clothing, footprints that led nowhere. Evidence that someone had been hiding in the forest, possibly for days or weeks. It was clear now why I had felt so watched, why the footsteps had seemed to circle the cabin, why every sound had made my blood run cold. I had been in the territory of someone who did not want to be found, someone who knew how to move unseen. Even now, years later, I remember that forest vividly. The smell of damp pine, the creaking of the cabin, the oppressive silence that could suddenly become violent. I remember the footsteps outside my door, the feeling of being trapped with no way to escape. The memory is sharp and clear, a warning that the solitude I once sought can be dangerous, that the wilderness is not empty, that humans can be far more frightening than any imagined specter. I learned to respect that isolation. I never camp alone in remote areas anymore. I never assume that because I cannot see someone, I am truly alone. The experience taught me the value of caution, awareness, and preparation. And though I am able to tell the story now, able to place the fear in the past, I know that if I had made a single misstep that night, if I had opened that door for even a moment, the ending could have been very different. I escaped, but the lesson remains. The forest is beautiful, quiet, and freeing, but it is also unpredictable, unforgiving, and sometimes terrifyingly alive. I had been driving for hours, the winding mountain roads stretching endlessly before me. The sky was a flat gray, heavy with the promise of rain, and the trees lining the road were thick and unwelcoming, their trunks dark and wet from a recent storm. I was looking for a cabin I had rented through a last-minute listing online, a place tucked deep in the woods where I could spend a few days alone. I like solitude, I like silence, but the further I drove, the more I realized how isolated I truly was. The GPS signal had long since disappeared, leaving me with only a crumpled map I barely understood. Every turn seemed to take me deeper into the wilderness, and with every mile, I felt a growing knot of unease in my stomach. The cabin was supposed to be down a narrow, unpaved road. I turned onto it hesitantly, the tires crunching over loose gravel and fallen leaves. The branches overhead scratched against my windshield as if testing my patience. The road narrowed even more, barely wide enough for one car, and it wound sharply up a small ridge. My hands gripped the steering wheel tightly. The only sounds were the car engine and the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. After what felt like an eternity, I saw it. A small wooden cabin, partially hidden behind thick pines, with smoke rising from a chimney. Relief washed over me, but it was mixed with a quiet, unshakable tension. The place looked deserted, and though it was what I had come for, it immediately felt off. I parked my car and got out. The air was cold and damp, carrying the smell of wet earth and pine needles. The cabin was old but sturdy, made of dark wood that had weathered countless seasons. The windows were small and grimy, reflecting the dim light in jagged patterns. I approached the door and tried the handle. Locked. That was fine. The host had told me he would leave the key under the mat. I bent down, reached under the damp, faded doormat, and retrieved a small, rusty key. The key turned with some resistance, and the door creaked as it opened. Inside, the cabin smelled of old wood and something faintly sour, like damp fabric that had never dried. Dust covered the surfaces, and spider webs hung from the corners. It was exactly what I had expected. Isolated, bare, and simple. The main room was small, with a sagging sofa, a wooden table, and a wood stove in the corner. A narrow hallway led to a tiny kitchen on one side and a bedroom at the far end. I set my bag down and immediately started exploring, checking that everything was in working order. The stove seemed fine, the kitchen sink had water, and the small propane heater hummed quietly when I turned it on. Everything was functional, but the silence was overwhelming. Even the trees outside seemed unnervingly still, as though holding their breath. The first night was quiet, almost too quiet. I tried to read by the dim light of a lantern, but my thoughts kept drifting to the shadows moving just beyond the windows. Every branch scraping against the cabin, every sudden gust of wind, made me flinch. I eventually went to bed, but sleep came in fits. I kept waking up to strange noises, the creak of the floorboards, the distant snap of twigs outside. Every time I would lie frozen, listening, my imagination ran wild. Was it an animal, a human, or just the wind? I forced myself to calm down and eventually drifted back to sleep. The next morning, I decided to explore the area around the cabin. The forest was dense, the trees tall and close together, with thick underbrush making walking difficult. I stayed on a small trail I found near the cabin, moving carefully. The forest felt alive in a way that was both beautiful and threatening. Birds called in the distance, but their songs were sharp and tense, not comforting. As I walked, I noticed signs of animals. Broken branches, footprints in the mud, claw marks on trees. At one point, I saw a large deer standing motionless in a clearing, its dark eyes locked on me. I froze. We watched each other for what felt like minutes before it bounded away. My heart raced, but I reminded myself this was normal. This was nature. Later that evening, I decided to gather some firewood for the stove. I went to a nearby pile the host had left, picking up branches and logs that were dry enough to burn. As I stacked the wood near the stove, I noticed something odd. Footprints in the mud outside the cabin. They were fresh. They didn't look like deer or bear tracks, they were human. My stomach sank. I lived in a city, and while I had spent time in remote areas, this was different. These prints were too deliberate, too large to be a child's. Someone had been close to my cabin today. I told myself it was probably a hiker or another visitor passing through. Still, a cold unease settled in my chest. I double-checked the doors and windows, making sure everything was locked. I even set the wooden chair under the doorknob, a simple trick I had learned years ago just to feel safer. I tried to brush off the fear, focusing on cooking a simple dinner over the stove. The fire crackled, casting moving shadows across the room. I sat in the corner, eating in silence, listening. The forest was quiet now, too quiet, and the shadows seemed to stretch longer than they should. Around midnight, I woke to a sound that froze me in place. A low scraping at the window. My heart jumped into my throat. I held my breath, trying to make out what it was. There it was again, slow, deliberate scraping. Whoever it was knew the cabin was here. I reached for the small hatchet I kept near the stove, holding it tightly. The sound stopped as suddenly as it began. I sat in the dark, my ears straining, waiting for something else to happen. Minutes stretched into hours, and sleep was impossible. By dawn, I was exhausted, barely able to keep my eyes open. I spent the next day preparing. I gathered extra firewood, checked the windows, and even moved some furniture in front of doors to make barriers. I stayed near the center of the cabin, my senses constantly alert. I walked outside only when necessary, keeping the cabin within sight. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, sent my heart racing. That evening, I heard it again. Footsteps in the dirt, circling the cabin. I stayed low, listening. I knew I wasn't imagining it this time. Someone had been here, lingering near the cabin. The thought made my stomach churn. That night, I decided I couldn't stay passive. I had a small flashlight and my phone, though there was no signal. I checked the gun I had brought for emergencies, making sure it was loaded. Hours passed, and I remained awake, crouched near the bedroom doorway, flashlight in hand. Around 3 a.m., I heard it, a faint tapping at the back door. My hands shook as I shined the light toward the window. There was nothing. I took a deep breath and edged toward the door. My instincts screamed at me to stay back, but I needed to know. Slowly, carefully, I unlocked the door and peeked outside. The forest was still. Moonlight reflected off the wet leaves, and the air was cold and sharp. I saw tracks leading from the edge of the trees to the door. Large footprints like before, fresh in the mud. My chest tightened. Whoever it was, they had been here recently and were possibly still nearby. I took a step back inside and locked the door again, pressing my back against it. The next day, I made a decision. I couldn't stay another night. I packed my belongings quickly, taking only the essentials, and kept my eyes constantly on the forest edges. The tracks had multiplied overnight, circling the cabin, as though whoever had been here was making sure I knew I was not alone. I loaded my car and kept the engine running. Every shadow, every rustle of leaves, made me flinch. Finally, I took the narrow road back to the main path, gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles hurt. I drove for hours without stopping, only slowing when absolutely necessary. The mountains stretched endlessly, the dense forest a constant reminder of how small and vulnerable I had been. Eventually, I reached a small town, a place with a gas station and a diner, lights and people. Relief was overwhelming. I pulled over, letting myself breathe for the first time in 2 days. I called the local sheriff, explaining what had happened, and they said they would check the cabin. I didn't wait for their response. I stayed in town that night, choosing a small motel with a bright neon sign, its hum a comforting background noise. Days later, the sheriff called me. They had found footprints and clear signs someone had been at the cabin, sitting in the chairs, handling items, leaving evidence that they had spent hours inside and around the property. They didn't catch anyone, but they told me I had done the right thing leaving when I did. The cabin was secured after that, and the listing was taken down. I never returned, and I never forgot the feeling of that forest, that isolation, and the awareness that someone had been watching me, close enough to touch the walls of the cabin. Even now, years later, I think back to those nights. I think about the scraping at the window, the footprints circling the cabin, the suffocating silence of the forest. I realize how easily someone could be alone, completely isolated, and completely at the mercy of someone else. That cabin taught me that danger doesn't have to come from monsters or myths. It can come from any human, patient and unseen, lurking in the shadows, waiting. And the knowledge of that, the understanding that someone had been there and could have returned at any moment, is something I carry with me always. It's a caution, a memory, and a very real terror that needs no imagination to make it haunting. I had always liked the idea of being alone in the woods, the kind of quiet that presses against your ears, the smell of wet earth and decaying leaves, and the way the sunlight falls in slanted beams through tall, ancient trees. That particular summer, I decided to rent a cabin deep in the forest, miles from any road or town. It wasn't for vacation or adventure, not exactly. I needed space to think, to escape the constant noise of the city, and to prove to myself that I could be self-reliant. I packed a small bag with basic supplies, a first aid kit, canned food, water, a sleeping bag, a flashlight, a stove, and some extra batteries. I knew I was pushing it by not bringing a phone or any way to call for help, but part of me wanted that distance, the total isolation. The drive to the cabin took nearly 5 hours, mostly on a narrow, winding road that gradually turned from asphalt to gravel, and finally to dirt tracks so rough that I had to slow down to avoid bouncing the car into the surrounding trees. When I finally reached the clearing, I could see the cabin sitting there like it had always been part of the forest. It was small, maybe 12 by 12 feet, made of dark wood with a simple pitched roof. There was no electricity, no running water. A narrow chimney indicated a small wood stove inside. Outside, a pile of firewood was stacked neatly against the wall, and a rusted old lantern sat near the door. I parked the car and took a long, deep breath, feeling the kind of calm I hadn't felt in years. Inside, the cabin was dusty but tidy. The floorboards creaked when I walked, and the air smelled faintly of mold and wood smoke. There was a small table, a single chair, a bed in the corner, and the stove against one wall. The windows were dirty but intact, and I could see the forest stretching in every direction. I unpacked my things slowly, making sure everything was in order, and then I decided to take a walk around the clearing before it got dark. The sun was low, casting long shadows through the trees. The forest was dense, and the further I walked, the quieter it became. I noticed animal tracks in the soft soil. Deer, maybe raccoon, and smaller prints I couldn't identify. The ground was uneven, and the trees grew so closely together in places that I had to push branches aside to continue. I didn't worry. I felt safe. I had been in forests before. When I returned to the cabin, the sun had nearly disappeared, leaving only the faintest light over the treetops. I lit the stove with difficulty, struggling to get a flame from the wet kindling, and finally managed to warm a can of soup. I ate slowly, listening to the forest settle into night. Owls hooted in the distance, and the occasional rustle of leaves suggested something moving just out of sight. I reminded myself that I was alone, that any animal would avoid a human if it could. I went to bed early, feeling the ache of a long drive in my muscles. I had brought a small lantern and a flashlight, and I kept both by my side. Sleep came slowly, and I woke several times during the night to strange sounds. Twigs snapping, leaves rustling, and a soft thump that I couldn't place. Each time, I reminded myself it was probably an animal, maybe a raccoon or a deer, and that I was safe inside the cabin. The next morning, I woke to rain. It wasn't heavy, just a steady drizzle that made the forest smell damp and sharp. I cooked a breakfast of oats and coffee on the stove and watched the rain through the small window. The cabin was quiet except for the patter of water on the roof and the occasional splash of raindrops hitting the ground outside. I spent the day tidying the cabin, stacking firewood, and checking my supplies. There was nothing unusual, and I felt a sense of pride in my self-sufficiency. That evening, however, something changed. I had gone outside to gather more firewood, leaving the cabin door slightly ajar. When I returned, I noticed something that made my stomach tighten. A branch, broken from a nearby tree, lay at the edge of the clearing. At first, I told myself it must have fallen naturally. But then I noticed the pattern. There were several broken branches, bent in a way that suggested they had been pushed down deliberately. I felt a chill and went inside, making sure to close and lock the cabin door, though it was just a simple latch. I tried to shake it off, telling myself I was imagining things. The forest was wild, branches fall, animals move things, but the unease stayed with me as I prepared for the night. I made the fire in the stove brighter, keeping the cabin warm and illuminated. Every crackle of the wood seemed too loud, and every wind gust against the walls made me jump. Around midnight, I heard it. Footsteps, outside, heavy, deliberate, slow. I froze, listening, straining to hear over the roar of my own heartbeat. There was a pause, then the sound came again, moving along the perimeter of the cabin. It wasn't random, it was circling. My first thought was another human, someone who had found the cabin like I had. I had told no one I was coming here. There was no road that led to the cabin directly, not one a stranger could easily find without knowing. I didn't have a weapon, not really. The only thing I could think of was the fire poker next to the stove. I gripped it tightly and edged toward the window. Through the glass, I could see nothing. The night was dense, black, and the rain had stopped, leaving the forest dripping and silent. The footsteps stopped as well. My hands shook. I decided not to sleep. I lit the lantern, keeping it on the table in front of me, and I stayed awake, watching the window, listening to every small sound. Hours passed. The first light of dawn began to creep through the trees. Exhausted but vigilant, I finally ventured outside. The forest looked ordinary. Nothing had changed, nothing moved. But as I walked around the cabin, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Footprints in the mud. Not animal prints, human prints. Large, heavy boots, They circled the cabin completely, coming close enough that someone could have looked in the windows. I went back inside and packed quickly. I decided I couldn't stay another night. I loaded the car, checked the windows and doors, and started down the rough dirt road. My hands were still shaking, my mind replaying the circle of footsteps, the sound of someone or something watching me. The drive back felt endless. I didn't see anyone on the road, didn't hear anyone following, but the sense of being observed never left me. By the time I reached the paved road leading to civilization, I felt a cautious relief. I stopped at a small gas station, called a friend to let them know I was okay, and finally felt my body relax. I realized then what I had learned. Isolation can be peaceful, but it also exposes you to real danger. No fairy tales, no ghosts, just another human being with their own intentions moving through the same space as you. I never returned to that cabin. Weeks later, I learned from the rental company that trespassing had occurred multiple times in that area. Someone had been living in the woods, sneaking into cabins when the owners were away. I shivered at the thought of how close I had come to a real, violent encounter. I never went into the deep forest alone again. I still think about it. The quiet, the isolation, the footsteps circling the cabin. But I also remember the feeling of finally leaving, of seeing the road and knowing I was safe. That clarity, that hard-won sense of relief, was worth every terrifying moment. I had always wanted to spend a weekend in the woods alone, away from the constant noise and the endless routines of city life. My job had been draining me for months, and I needed something different, something that would pull me far from the constant hum of traffic, people, and responsibilities. I found a small cabin for rent online, tucked away in a dense forest about 3 hours from the nearest town. The pictures made it look isolated but cozy, a perfect place to disconnect. The cabin was old, built decades ago, but it was still well maintained, with a small fireplace, a kitchen with basic appliances, and a loft for sleeping. The description promised quiet, seclusion, and peace. That was exactly what I needed. I arrived in the late afternoon, the sun hanging low in the sky, casting long shadows over the dirt road that led to the cabin. The drive itself was unnerving in a subtle way. The forest seemed to close in on the narrow path, the trees so tall and dense that in some places the sunlight barely reached the ground. The road was lined with thick brush, and I passed only one other car, which was parked haphazardly on the side, abandoned, or at least looking abandoned. It gave me a small flicker of unease, but I shrugged it off. People often parked in odd spots in rural areas. When I finally reached the cabin, I parked the car and stepped out, stretching after hours of driving. The air smelled fresh, cold, and earthy, the scent of pine needles thick on the breeze. The cabin itself sat in a small clearing. It was made of rough-hewn logs, weathered but solid. The windows were small, with wooden shutters, and a thin wisp of smoke drifted from the chimney. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The smell of wood and old stone filled the air. Dust lay lightly on the floorboards, but the place had been cleaned enough to be comfortable. I dropped my bag, walked around, and checked the rooms. The loft was simple but clean. The kitchen had enough utensils and a small stove. There was a small stack of firewood by the fireplace. I felt a sense of relief. This was perfect. I spent the rest of the afternoon unpacking, making a simple dinner, and lighting the fireplace to warm the room as the evening drew in. The sun sank lower, and shadows from the trees stretched into the clearing, dark and thick. The forest was quiet, save for the occasional bird or the rustling of small animals in the underbrush. At first, the silence was comforting, almost peaceful. I settled in, reading a book near the fire, letting my mind drift. By the time I went up to the loft, night had fallen completely, and the forest outside was a wall of darkness. Sleep was fitful. Every creak of the cabin, every whisper of wind against the walls, seemed louder than it should be. I kept telling myself it was nothing, that the house was old and the forest was alive, but I could not shake the sense of being watched. I woke multiple times during the night, drawn to the window by the faint outlines of trees, the shadows moving in ways that made me uneasy. I had brought a flashlight, and I would shine it across the clearing, seeing nothing, yet the feeling lingered. It was a subtle, quiet fear, the kind that gnaws at the edges of your mind when you are completely alone. By dawn, I was exhausted, but the morning light helped, filling the cabin with a soft glow that made the shadows retreat. The next day, I decided to explore the surrounding forest. The cabin had a small trail leading out into the woods, which was visible in the clearing. I packed a backpack with water, some food, and a first aid kit, and I set off. The trail was narrow, covered in fallen leaves and pine needles, and it twisted unpredictably through the dense trees. First, it was beautiful. Sunlight filtered through the high canopy, illuminating patches of wildflowers and moss-covered stones. Birds chirped in the distance. Small animals darted across the path. I felt alive, almost euphoric in the solitude. But as I went deeper, the forest began to change. The light dimmed, even though the sun was still high. The air felt heavier, damp and cold in places. I started noticing odd things. Small piles of broken branches that looked deliberate, scuffed bark on trees at eye level, and footprints in the mud that did not match any animal I knew. They were too large and spaced strangely. I paused, scanning the forest, and the silence seemed thicker here. I had the sudden, inexplicable feeling that someone or something was following me. I called out softly to myself, a habit I had picked up from hiking alone, but there was no answer. Only the wind rustled the leaves. I tried to shake the unease and continued walking, telling myself I was being paranoid. By late afternoon, I realized I had wandered further than I intended. The trail had disappeared into dense underbrush. The footprints had stopped, but the sense of being watched intensified. Every rustle, every snapped twig, made my heart pound. I tried to retrace my steps, but the forest all looked the same. I realized I was lost. Panic began to creep in, slow and steady. I sat down on a mossy log, taking deep breaths, trying to calm myself. I had a compass in my bag, but I realized I had not checked the map closely before leaving. I was relying on memory, which was failing me. I knew the sun would set soon, and I could not imagine navigating back in the dark through this dense forest. As the sun dipped lower, I heard noises. At first, they were distant. The crack of branches, the thump of something moving heavily through the underbrush. I froze, straining my ears. The noises came closer. They were deliberate, not random. My mind raced, imagining animals, hunters, or worse. I gripped the flashlight in my hand, switching it on. Its beam cut through the gathering shadows. I saw movement ahead, a figure, crouched, moving slowly among the trees. My pulse spiked. I could not see clearly. The shape seemed human, but its movements were strange, methodical, careful. I had no idea if it had seen me. I turned back, trying to head toward the direction I thought the cabin was, but the undergrowth was thick, slowing me down. I could hear it behind me now, breaking branches, moving faster. Fear took over. I stumbled through roots and mud, falling multiple times. My knees and hands were scraped, my backpack swinging wildly, but I did not stop. I had to get out. I remembered the clearing near the cabin, where the land opened up. I ran toward that memory, praying it was correct. The forest seemed endless, shadows stretching impossibly, turning familiar paths into confusing mazes. Night fell fully. The moon was high but obscured by clouds. My flashlight flickered as I ran blindly, and I realized I had no choice but to keep moving, to keep heading in the general direction of the clearing. Then I tripped over a root and fell face first into the mud. I lay there, breathing heavily, hands shaking, covered in dirt. The figure's movements stopped. For a moment, the forest was silent again. I dared to lift my head. There was nothing immediately near me. I scrambled to my feet, mud on my clothes, blood from my scraped knees mixing with it. I had to keep going. Hours passed, though it felt like minutes and days at once. The forest was relentless. My flashlight was dying. My water was almost gone. My legs ached. My hands were raw, and my lungs burned from the cold air. But then, just as despair was starting to take over, I saw it, a faint light through the trees. I ran toward it, moving faster than I had imagined possible. As I got closer, I realized it was the cabin, its windows glowing softly with the remaining daylight reflecting off the glass. Relief flooded me, almost knocking me to the ground in gratitude. I reached the cabin, throwing open the door and collapsing inside. I locked it immediately, breathing hard, shaking, trying to process everything. The fireplace was cold, but I had firewood. I lit the fire again, feeling the warmth spread through my body. I checked the locks on the windows, securing them as best I could. The sense of being hunted had not fully disappeared, but for the first time in hours, I felt some safety. I sat near the fire, exhausted, covered in mud, bleeding slightly from scrapes and scratches, and slowly began to calm down. I spent the rest of the night sitting in the firelight, too anxious to sleep. I kept thinking about what I had seen, what had followed me. I realized that the forest was unpredictable and sometimes dangerous, especially when you are alone and unprepared. The isolation that had seemed so inviting now felt like a trap. The experience was terrifying but also clarifying. I understood my limits, my vulnerability, and the thin line between safety and danger in the wilderness. By morning, I felt more in control. I cleaned myself as best I could, bandaging cuts and washing off the mud with the cold water from the cabin. I packed my bag carefully, making sure I had a clear path to follow this time. I would not wander far. I stayed close to the cabin and the small trails I knew. Over the next day, I explored cautiously, marking the paths with small stones and noting landmarks so I would not lose my way. The forest was still intimidating, but I had learned to respect it, to move deliberately and carefully. I kept my flashlight ready and stayed alert to every sound. Each step was measured, each decision cautious. By the second evening, I had a routine. I stayed in the clearing, built a more secure perimeter around the cabin using logs and stones, and kept firewood ready. I could not forget the feeling of being followed, the fear that had gripped me, but I also knew that I had survived, that I had found ways to protect myself, and that I could continue to do so. The forest was still vast and wild, but I had found a balance. I slept lightly, keeping one ear tuned to the sounds outside, but I also felt a strange pride. I had faced the fear, endured it, and come through intact. On the final morning, I packed my belongings and prepared to leave. The forest seemed calmer in the early light. Birds chirped, small animals moved through the underbrush, and the sun warmed the clearing. I took a long look at the cabin, at the place that had tested me so severely, and I felt gratitude. It had been frightening, exhausting, and humbling, but it had also taught me resilience. I locked the cabin carefully, leaving a note for the next visitor about the trails and the precautions I had learned. Then I drove away slowly, taking one last glance at the dense trees that had nearly swallowed me. I knew I would remember this experience for the rest of my life. Not as a fairy tale, not as a story of ghosts, but as a realistic encounter with nature's unpredictable and sometimes frightening power. Driving back to civilization, the sun fully up now, I felt a weight lift from me. The city's noise was no longer oppressive. It felt familiar, almost comforting. But the lessons of the forest lingered. I had learned how fragile human safety can be when faced with isolation and unpredictability, how small mistakes can escalate into life-threatening situations. And I had learned that fear, real fear, is both debilitating and instructive. I would never take solitude lightly again. By the time I reached the nearest town, I felt transformed. I had faced danger, navigated it, and survived. The memory of the figure that had stalked me, whether human or not, would stay with me, a stark reminder of how careful and aware one must be when alone in the wild. But I also carried a deep satisfaction. I had endured, I had survived, and I had returned stronger, wiser, and more cautious. That cabin, that forest, had changed me, and even though I would likely never return, the experience would remain vivid, unforgettable, and completely real. I drove up the narrow dirt road late in the afternoon, watching the trees crowd closer on both sides as if they were slowly closing me in. The cabin sat alone on top of a small rise, surrounded by tall pine and uneven ground full of rocks and old roots. The place looked even more isolated than I expected, and the silence around it felt heavier than normal countryside quiet. It had that kind of quiet that made you notice your own breathing, like the world was holding itself still. I had rented the cabin for a week because I needed space away from the noise of the city. My job had been wearing me down, and I felt tired every morning even when I slept full nights. I thought silence and nature would fix something inside me. I kept telling myself that. Still, as I got out of the car and heard the wind pushing lightly through the trees, I already felt something different about the air. Not dangerous, but uncomfortable, like walking into a room where the furniture was arranged in a strange way. The driveway was small and uneven. My tires crunched over gravel as I parked. I stepped out and breathed the cold air. The place smelled like wet dirt and old wood, the kind of smell that sticks to your clothes. The cabin itself was simple, with one porch light and dark windows that reflected the forest behind me. Inside, everything looked old but clean. There was one main room with a wooden table, shelves full of things left by other guests, and a small kitchen area with a fridge that hummed quietly. A hallway led to a single bedroom with a narrow window. The bathroom was small and had a thin shower curtain that looked like it had been replaced too many times. I walked around, trying to get used to the silence, but the more I moved through the cabin, the more I felt like the silence was following me instead of me settling into it. It felt like being watched, not by a person, but by the space itself. I unpacked a little, ate something simple, and tried to relax, but I couldn't stop glancing toward the windows. Each one showed the same thing. Thick forest, no movement, tall dark trees pressed together. The longer I looked, the more it felt like the forest was hiding something, like it wasn't just trees and darkness. It was something waiting quietly. At dusk, the temperature dropped fast. I stepped onto the porch with a jacket on, watching the sky turn purple behind the treetops. The quiet got heavier with the cold. I looked toward the dirt road I came in from. It bent around the trees sharply so you couldn't see very far. For some reason, I didn't like that. It felt like anything could walk around that bend and show up without warning. I went back inside before it got fully dark. The cabin felt warmer with the lights on, but also more closed in. I kept hearing small noises outside, branches snapping, leaves shifting, something brushing against the siding. I told myself it was animals, wind, the type of noises cabins always make in forests. Still, each sound made my muscles tighten a little more. When it finally got completely dark, the forest turned into a black wall around the cabin. The windows reflected only the inside of the room, and I couldn't see anything beyond the glass. That somehow made the darkness feel closer. I tried to sleep early, but lying in the bed made everything worse. The mattress felt too thin, the pillow too flat, and I kept hearing things outside. Not loud things, just small, slow noise. Slow steps, or maybe branches falling. Hard to tell. The walls were thin and the sounds carried clearly. I forced my eyes closed and tried to breathe slowly. For a moment I thought I'd fall asleep, but then something hit the side of the cabin. Not hard, but sharp, like a rock hitting wood. I opened my eyes and stared at the dark ceiling, waiting. Nothing else happened for a while. I told myself it was probably a pine cone hitting the wall or a branch finally giving up and falling. I stayed awake for hours anyway, listening, feeling every small vibration through the bed frame. At some point during the night, I finally slept. When I woke up, the room was filled with pale morning light. I stayed in bed for a little while, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling from the night before. I went outside to breathe some fresh air and tell myself it was all in my head. But when I stepped onto the porch, I froze. In the dirt next to the cabin wall, I saw footprints. Human footprints. They weren't mine. I had walked on the porch and the driveway, not along the side of the cabin where the prints were. They were close to the wall, like someone had been standing directly beside the cabin during the night, maybe even leaning against it. The prints looked fresh. The dirt was slightly damp, and the edges of the prints were sharp, not softened by wind or time. My stomach tightened. I looked around the trees, scanning for movement, but everything was still. The forest didn't feel calm though. It felt like it was holding something behind its stillness. I walked the area slowly, checking if more prints were around. They led from the trees to the cabin wall, then back toward the forest on the other side. Whoever it was didn't walk past the front porch or anywhere close to the door. It felt deliberate, like they kept to the shadows, staying out of sight. I spent a long time standing there, trying to convince myself it could be something else. But the size and shape of the prints were clear. They belonged to a man, probably wearing boots. I went back inside and locked the door even though it was daytime. I sat at the table with my hands flat against the wood, trying to think calmly. The place didn't have cell service, and the cabin didn't have Wi-Fi either. I could drive down the road to get a signal if needed, but the idea of leaving the cabin or walking to the car made my skin crawl. I stayed inside most of the day. Every now and then I would go to the window trying to look between the trees, but I couldn't see anything moving. The whole forest felt like it was waiting again. Around late afternoon, something else happened. I noticed a piece of wood near the back of the cabin that looked slightly chipped. When I got closer, I saw fresh scratch marks on the wall. Not animal scratches. These looked like they were made by something sharp dragged lightly across the surface. Thin lines scraped through the weathered paint, maybe from a knife or another metal tool. Not deep, but clear enough to look intentional. My throat got dry. I touched the edge of one of the scratches and felt the raw wood beneath. Someone had stood right here in the dark, close enough to touch the wall. I went back inside again, shut the door, and locked it. The cabin suddenly felt too small, like the walls were closing in on me. I paced across the floor, trying to slow my breathing, but the thought that someone had been near the cabin at night stayed in my head no matter what I did. When night came again, the fear hit much harder. I turned off the lights and sat on the couch, trying to keep myself calm. The darkness outside felt heavier than the night before. Every sound made me freeze. I listened so hard that my head hurt. At some point, I heard it again, the slow steps outside. Not right against the cabin yet, but moving through the trees. The sound of leaves being pushed aside. The crunch of something heavy on the ground. I sat completely still, breathing shallow and quiet. The steps got closer. Then they stopped. The silence after the steps was even worse than the sound itself. I stared at the front door, feeling every muscle in my body tense. A moment passed, then another, and then I heard something I will never forget. A slow drag along the wall. Not a scratch this time, more like a hand running across the wood. Slow, steady, moving from one end of the cabin toward the other. Then another step, then another long drag. My chest tightened so hard I felt a sharp pain. Whoever was out there wasn't trying to break in. They were doing something else. Watching, testing, maybe trying to see if I would react. The drag kept moving around the cabin. I sat frozen, afraid that any movement might make the person stop walking and start doing something worse. The sound eventually faded toward the back of the cabin. I waited for a very long time. Finally, when I thought maybe the stranger had left, something tapped the bedroom window. One single tap, light but clear, like a fingertip against glass. I didn't look, couldn't. I just sat there with my hands shaking, trying not to breathe too loudly. The tap didn't come again. There were no more footsteps. Hours passed before the night ended. When morning finally came, I checked outside again. Even though every part of me wanted to get in the car and leave immediately, I felt like I needed to know how bad things were before I left. The dirt around the cabin was full of fresh footprints, many more than before. They circled the cabin slowly, weaving around it like the person had walked loops during the night. On the back wall, near the window, were more scratch marks. Longer this time. I felt sick. I walked back to the front, trying to stay calm, and I noticed something else. Just near the porch, something half buried in the dirt. I crouched down and picked it up. A small metal bolt. Old, rusty, but not naturally dropped from anything. It looked like it might have been carried and dropped by accident. That meant the person had been close to the porch. Probably closer than I realized. That was enough for me. I grabbed my bag, not bothering to pack everything. I just shoved what I needed inside, grabbed my keys, and walked fast to the car. Every step felt like someone was watching me from the trees. I didn't look behind me. I didn't even look at the forest. I got in the car and locked the doors. My hands shook as I started the engine. The dirt road felt narrower than before, like the trees were pressing in as I left. I drove fast, faster than I should have on that road. When I finally reached the spot where the road bent, I checked the rearview mirror. Someone stood on the rise near the cabin. A tall figure, still, watching me leave. I couldn't see the face. The person didn't move, not even when the car jolted over a deep rut. Just watched. I didn't slow down. I didn't stop. I only looked away from the mirror when the person disappeared behind the bend. When I finally reached an area with cell service, I stopped the car and called the authorities. I gave them the location, told them what happened, and waited in my locked car until help arrived. They took my report and told me they would search the area. They didn't sound sure they would find anyone. I never went back to the cabin. I didn't even return for the things I left behind. For days after that, I kept seeing the prints in my mind. The marks on the wall, the shape of the figure standing near the cabin as I drove away. But the worst part was the tap on the window. Knowing that someone had stood inches away from me, separated only by a thin sheet of glass. They never forced their way in, never tried to break anything. They just walked around the cabin in the dark, tracing the walls, watching quietly, waiting for something. And somehow, the fact that they didn't act made it all much worse. Because it meant that whatever they wanted, they were patient. And they were close. Every night since then, I still wake up sometimes thinking I hear that same slow drag across a wall outside my bedroom. I know it's not real. I know I'm safe. I know the cabin is miles away. But the memory stays clear inside me, and I think it always will. Because that night taught me something I never knew before. It's not the loud threats you should fear the most. It's the quiet ones. The ones that wait in silence, just outside the light, walking slowly in circles around your home. The ones who never say what they want. The ones who never leave a clear reason behind. The ones who simply watch. Those are the ones that stay with you forever. I reached the cabin late in the afternoon after a long drive across the narrow mountain roads. The place looked smaller than I remembered from the photos. The wood on the outside walls looked old, with dark patches where rainwater had been dripping for years. The porch was slanted slightly to one side as if the house had been settling into the ground. The trees around it were tall and close, almost too close, with branches leaning over the roof. The air felt still in a strange way, like everything was waiting for something to happen. I had rented it thinking it would be quiet, a place where I could think, rest, and get away from everything. When I stepped inside, the air smelled stale, a mix of dust and damp wood. The cabin had only one main room, a small bathroom, and a storage room with a crooked door that barely stayed shut. The floor creaked under my shoes even when I barely put weight on it. The windows were small and old, with glass that looked uneven and scratched from the inside. As I walked through the cabin, I kept noticing how cold it felt even though the sun was still out. It didn't feel like the cold that comes from weather. It felt more like a place that had been closed for too long, a place where the air had not moved in weeks. I dropped my bag on the bed and looked around again. Something about the silence felt strange. I expected a forest to have sounds. Wind pushing through branches, birds moving between trees, insects clicking or buzzing, but the woods felt too quiet. The whole place felt like it was disconnected from everything around it. I told myself I just needed to settle in. I walked outside to bring in some firewood because the cabin had an old stove that looked like it needed constant feeding. The firewood pile sat behind the cabin near the tree line. As I picked up the first logs, I noticed something strange in the dirt. Footprints. Not fresh, but not old either. They were deeper than mine and spread far apart as if the person had been walking with long strides. The prints moved along the back of the cabin, following the wall, stopping near the small bathroom window, then continuing into the woods. I stared at them for a long time. Maybe a hiker passed by. Maybe someone lived nearby. The mountains had scattered houses and cabins, and I knew there were people who lived out here all year. Still, seeing footprints so close to the bathroom window bothered me more than I wanted to admit. I picked up the firewood fast and went back inside, closing the door slowly as if I didn't want to make noise. I kept the door locked even during the day. Every time the floor creaked, I found myself looking toward the windows. I walked around the cabin to check if the prints were still there, but the shadows from the trees had shifted, making it harder to see the ground. The quietness grew heavier, and even though nothing was happening, it felt like something might. My mind kept going back to the footprints next to the bathroom window. They were too close, too intentional. That night, after I made a small fire, I sat on the bed and tried to read. I kept glancing toward the door like I expected it to move. The fire in the stove popped and cracked, and every sound made me jerk my head toward it. When the flames got low, the shadows in the cabin grew larger and looked like they moved with the firelight. The air thickened, and the cold felt sharper. I lay down after midnight because my eyes were tired, but my mind wouldn't slow down. I kept thinking about the woods behind the cabin. I kept thinking about the footprints. I kept imagining someone standing outside watching the cabin the way I watched the door. When I closed my eyes, I felt like someone was standing behind me even though I knew I was alone. I must have fallen asleep sometime after that, but it didn't feel like real sleep. It felt like drifting in and out of shallow dreams where nothing made sense. When I finally opened my eyes, the cabin was dark except for the faint glow from the stove. The fire had dropped to almost nothing, but the faint red light made the room look uneasy. I was about to get up to add more wood when I heard a sound outside. It was faint but sharp enough to stop my breath. It sounded like a footstep on the wooden porch. The boards made a low cracking sound, the same kind of sound they made when I walked across them earlier. I froze, listening so hard that it felt like the rest of the world disappeared. The dark felt heavier. The porch creaked again. I stayed completely still, afraid the slightest movement would make noise. I tried to slow my breathing because it felt too loud in the quiet cabin. The air felt thinner. I kept waiting for the sound to repeat, but after the second creak, everything went silent again. I forced myself to count to 60 before I moved. The cabin was too dark to see anything clearly. I sat up slowly and let my eyes adjust. The windows were black rectangles. I couldn't see anything through them. I added wood to the stove carefully, trying to make as little noise as possible. The silence outside felt like it was pressing against the cabin walls. After a few minutes, I finally convinced myself to go back to bed. I stayed awake until the fire brightened the room and morning light pushed through the windows. Only then did I let myself breathe normally. When I went outside, the boards of the porch looked the same. I checked the ground around the cabin, but if there had been new footprints, the soil was too firm or too shadowed to see them clearly. The stillness outside felt wrong again, like something wasn't finished. I considered leaving that morning, but I didn't want to feel like I was overreacting. I tried to brush off the night sounds as the house settling or animals moving around. I reminded myself that cabins make strange noises. Wood shifts, animals wander, but the memory of the porch creaking under weight felt too clear, too real. I spent most of the morning trying to distract myself by cleaning the inside of the cabin. The place had layers of dust, especially on the shelves and corners. I wiped down the counter, swept the floor, and moved some old tools leaning against the wall. The more I cleaned, the more I realized how little the place had been used. The air still felt stale no matter how long I kept the window cracked. There were signs that other people had stayed here. Small scraps of packaging under the bed, an old lighter on the floor, a rusted can opener in the drawer. But nothing looked recent. For a moment, I wondered if the rental website even belonged to the real owner. The cabin didn't look cared for. Around noon, I went for a walk down the path that led away from the cabin. The path curved through the trees and down a small slope. Every time a branch snapped under my shoe, I jumped a little. I kept looking behind me even though nothing was there. I didn't see any footprints except my own. After about 15 minutes, I turned around. The woods felt too quiet again, like they were listening to me instead of the other way around. I didn't want to stay far from the cabin. When I got back, I noticed something strange. The firewood I stacked near the back door was slightly off. One of the logs was leaning in a way I didn't remember. It was small, almost nothing, but I stared at it for a long time. It looked like someone had moved it. Maybe an animal bumped it. Maybe I stacked it badly. But the angle didn't make sense. It looked like someone had picked it up and put it back down differently. I didn't like that thought at all. I spent the rest of the day inside, keeping the door locked and checking the windows too often. The afternoon dragged on slowly. I made food, but I barely tasted it. I kept thinking about the porch sound. I kept thinking about the woodpile. I kept thinking about the footprints from yesterday. When night came again, I felt my stomach tighten. The cabin grew dark too fast. I added more wood to the stove and tried to keep the room bright, but the shadows stretched farther than I wanted them to. Every sound from outside felt louder than before. I could hear the wind moving through the trees, but it didn't sound like normal wind. It felt too thin, like it was slipping through the woods in a strange way. I stayed awake as long as I could, sitting in the chair near the stove with my eyes fixed on the door. I didn't even want to blink. When the fire dropped low and the light faded again, I kept thinking something might happen. I kept thinking something or someone might come back to the porch. The air in the cabin felt cold and tight. At some point, my eyes closed without me realizing. I woke up slowly, feeling stiff and cold. The cabin was dark again. I didn't know how long I had slept, but the fire was down to glowing embers. I sat up and listened. For a moment, everything was silent. Then I heard it, not on the porch this time, behind the cabin, a soft crunching sound, footsteps in the dirt. My heart felt like it stopped completely. The steps moved slowly, not in a straight line but circling the back of the cabin. I stayed completely still, barely breathing. The footsteps stopped near the small bathroom window. I pictured the exact place where the old footprints were. I waited in the dark, trying to understand what was happening. The footsteps moved again, this time toward the sidewall, toward the storage room. They were slow, controlled, not confused like an animal. Each step felt intentional. I imagined someone slow walking around the cabin, listening, checking the walls, getting closer to the windows. The footsteps stopped again. Then I heard the softest tap on the wall, like a finger pressing lightly against the wood. The sound was so faint that I wasn't sure at first. I leaned forward slightly, holding my breath. The tapping came again. A single quiet tap, then nothing. I felt frozen in the chair. I didn't want to move. I didn't want to make any noise at all. Minutes passed in heavy silence. The footsteps didn't come back. The tapping stopped. The woods outside felt dead silent. I stayed in the chair until the windows began to lighten with early morning. Only when the forest turned gray did I feel safe enough to stand. I went outside the moment the sun rose fully. I walked slowly around the cabin, checking the dirt near the walls and windows. At first, I didn't see anything. The ground near the bathroom window looked the same as the day before. I walked around the back, my eyes scanning the soil. Then I saw it. A fresh footprint near the storage room wall. Deep, clear, facing the cabin. It was bigger than mine. The heel was pressed hard into the dirt, like someone had leaned forward while stepping. I felt my chest tighten. I walked backward without turning away from the footprint. The woods around the cabin suddenly felt too close, too dark near the tree line. I kept looking from tree to tree, trying to see if someone was standing there. The woods were empty, but the silence was heavier than ever. I went inside and locked the door. I paced through the cabin, trying to think straight. I kept going back to the footprint. Whoever it belonged to had been standing close to the wall, close enough to touch the cabin, close enough to tap it. I couldn't stay another night. I knew that, but the thought of packing and making noise made me feel unsafe. I didn't know where the stranger was. I didn't know if he was watching me. I tried to calm myself, but my hands shook every time I touched something. I forced myself to pack slowly, folding clothes and placing them inside my bag. Every creak of the floor made me look toward the windows. I kept checking the door, making sure it was locked. Before leaving, I checked the storage room because I wanted to be sure nothing inside had been disturbed. The door stuck again before it opened. The room was small with shelves of old tools and jars. Dust covered everything. Then I noticed something strange. There was a patch of dust on the floor near the shelves that looked disturbed. The shape wasn't clear, but it looked like something or someone had stepped there recently. The dust was lighter in that patch, like something had brushed it aside. I stared at it for a long time, feeling a sick heaviness grow in my chest. Someone had been in that room. I didn't know when, I didn't know how, but the dust told me what I needed to know. I closed the door, backed away from it, and grabbed my bag. I didn't care about anything else. I didn't care about cleaning up or checking the stove. I only wanted to get out. I opened the front door slowly, looking around before stepping outside. The woods were still. The air felt thick. I walked fast toward my car, my eyes scanning every tree, every shadow. I unlocked the car and got inside, locking the doors right away. My hands were shaking so badly I fumbled the keys twice before I started the engine. I drove down the narrow road faster than I should have. Every turn felt like it took too long. Every patch of trees felt like it was hiding someone. I didn't look back once. I didn't want to see if someone stepped out of the woods behind me. When I finally reached the main road, I felt my chest release a little. The woods were behind me. The cabin was behind me. The stranger was behind me. The silence of that place felt far away. But even now, I think about the footsteps. I think about the tapping on the wall. I think about the footprint facing the cabin. I think about the disturbed dust in the storage room. I think about how close that stranger had been to where I slept. And the ending is clear to me now. Someone had been watching the cabin long before I arrived. Someone who lived in those woods. Someone who moved silently. Someone who walked right up to the walls at night and listened. Someone who stepped inside the storage room when the cabin was empty. Someone who knew the cabin better than I did. And if I had stayed one more night, I know that person wouldn't have stopped at tapping the wall. They were checking the cabin. They were checking me. And eventually they were going to come inside. I planned the cabin trip because I needed to get away from everything. For months I had been feeling tired in a way that sleep never fixed. My head felt crowded all the time, like I was carrying too many thoughts at once, and every day at work felt the same. I kept telling myself I just needed a quiet place with no noise. No people, no city sounds, just trees and open air. When I finally found a small, isolated cabin listed online, deep inside a forest area that barely had any visitors during the winter months, I booked it without thinking twice. The photos showed a small wooden cabin with a metal roof, surrounded by tall pines and rough ground. It had one room, a small bathroom, a tiny kitchen area, and a little porch that looked out over a slope that dipped into a long stretch of thick forest. What caught my eye was how alone it looked. There was no sign of other homes or cabins near it. The listing even mentioned that the closest neighbor was nearly a kilometer away. It was exactly the kind of isolation I wanted. When the day came to drive out there, the weather was colder than I expected. The sky looked heavy, covered with pale gray clouds that seemed to sit low enough to touch. The road leading to the forest was empty, and after a while it turned into a smaller gravel road that shook the car every few seconds. I kept feeling like I was getting farther from everything familiar, and even though that was what I wanted, I still felt a strange pressure in my chest the deeper I drove. The trees were tall and crowded, their branches reaching over the road and blocking part of the sky. The forest felt old. Not in a supernatural way, just in the sense that everything around me looked untouched, like nothing had changed here for years. By the time I reached the marker the owner mentioned in his instructions, a rusted metal sign half buried in the ground, I felt like I had entered a different world entirely. The cabin sat at the end of a narrow dirt path. When I stepped out of the car, the first thing I noticed was how quiet it was. Not just quiet, but empty. The kind of quiet that almost feels unnatural because there's no wind, no birds, no movement, just stillness. For a moment, I stood next to the car and listened, waiting for something to break it, but nothing did. The cabin looked a little older than the pictures showed. The wood was darker, and the steps leading up to the porch had small cracks in them. The door had scratches on it, fresh-looking ones near the bottom, as if something had scraped at it recently. I told myself it was an animal, maybe a dog or something wild that wandered by. I didn't think much of it at the time. Inside, the air smelled like old wood and dust. The interior was plain, with a small bed pushed against the wall, a table next to it, and a shelf with a few old canned goods left behind by previous renters. There was a small stove, a tiny fridge, and a sink with a metal faucet that looked a bit rusty. It felt simple and empty, which was exactly what I wanted. I spent the first hour unpacking my things and cleaning up a bit. Dust covered the table and windowsills, and cobwebs hung in the corners. The floor creaked every time I stepped on certain spots, and the place felt colder than outside. I kept rubbing my hands together because the air inside had a strange stillness to it, as if the walls trapped the cold. When I finished settling in, I stepped back outside to get some fresh air. The forest stretched out endlessly, and the ground sloped downward behind the cabin. I could see faint deer tracks in the dirt, and broken branches lay scattered around like something large had moved through recently. The air smelled sharp and clean, and even though the stillness felt strange, it also felt peaceful in a way. I walked around the cabin once to make sure everything looked normal. The scratches on the door still bothered me, only because they looked too fresh. The edges of the wood were pale, showing where the dark surface had been scraped back. But I tried not to think too much about it. Wild animals were always unpredictable, and it wasn't unusual for them to sniff around buildings when humans weren't around. When evening came, the light faded earlier than I expected. The clouds thickened, and the sky turned dim even before sunset. I made myself a simple meal on the stove and sat near the window, watching as the forest grew darker. The shadows between the trees became long, thick spaces of black, and the slope behind the cabin disappeared completely into darkness. I wasn't scared at that point, not yet, but I was aware of how alone I was. No neighbors, no nearby houses, no cell signal inside the cabin. When I stepped outside earlier, I had to walk nearly 20 meters away from the structure just to get a weak bar of service. It was enough to send a short message, but not enough for a call. The silence outside the cabin got heavier as night came. I could hear my own breathing in my ears. Even though there was no wind, the trees still made occasional soft noises, like settling creaks or little taps of branches moving slightly even though nothing was pushing them. As night deepened, I started to notice something strange. Every once in a while, I thought I heard something faint on the slope behind the cabin. Not footsteps exactly, but the sound of weight shifting on loose soil. A soft crunch, then silence. Then another crunch, like something careful was moving down there. I kept telling myself it was nothing. Maybe a deer, maybe a rabbit. The forest was full of animals, but the sound seemed heavier than that. Slower, more deliberate. I stayed near the window for a long time, staring into the darkness, even though I knew I couldn't see anything down there. After a while, the sound stopped, and I managed to relax again. When I got ready for bed, the cabin felt colder. I had to wear thick socks and a sweater just to feel comfortable under the blankets. The mattress was thin and uneven, and the silence pressed against my ears until I could hear faint ringing inside my head. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up suddenly. I didn't know why at first. The cabin was pitch black except for a faint sliver of moonlight coming through a crack in the curtains. I lay still, trying to figure out what had woken me, and then I heard it. A soft, slow sound. Something brushing lightly against the cabin wall. It started near the back of the cabin. A soft drag, like something touching the wood and moving alongside it. My body froze instantly. I could feel my heartbeat pounding in my chest, and the air felt colder, almost sharp. The sound moved along the wall, a slow, dragging motion, then stopped near the window. I stayed completely still. I didn't move a muscle. My breathing became shallow. I stared at the window even though I couldn't see anything out of it. Then the sound moved again, toward the front of the cabin. It was so slow, like whoever or whatever was doing it was taking their time. My mind raced through possibilities. A long streak of dirt, like a dirty hand had dragged across the surface. I backed away slowly, my whole body cold. I checked the door. It was still locked. I checked the windows, all closed. I checked the bathroom, empty. Nothing else looked disturbed, but the dirt was fresh. Someone had been inside while I slept. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night, I sat against the wall with the flashlight in my hand until morning. My back ached. My eyes felt dry. The cabin felt smaller every hour. When the sun came up, I stepped outside carefully and looked around. More pine needles were disturbed. This time, the marks circled part of the clearing. They weren't random. They looked like someone had been walking back and forth near the trees for a long time. I felt sick realizing the person outside wasn't just passing through. They were watching, waiting, maybe studying the cabin, maybe studying me. I considered leaving that morning. My car was right there, but I felt trapped by uncertainty. I didn't know if someone was hiding in the woods. I didn't know if they were watching the road. I didn't know how long they had been around the property. The idea of driving through miles of forest with no cell signal and someone possibly following me made me hesitate. I convinced myself I would leave the next day. I told myself one more night wouldn't change anything. I was wrong. The third day felt heavier. The air felt colder even though the sun was out. The forest sounded too quiet. I heard fewer birds than before. The few sounds I did hear were sharp and quick, like small animals darting through the underbrush. Nothing peaceful. I stayed inside most of the day. I locked the door even when the sun was high. I checked the windows too often. Every creak of the cabin made my chest tighten. I kept thinking about the dirt on the counter. The idea of someone standing feet away from me while I slept, watching me in the dark, breathing quietly. By evening, I already knew I wouldn't sleep, but I still lay down because my body felt drained. My eyelids felt heavy even though fear kept me alert. Sometime after midnight, something woke me again. This sound was different. Not outside, not in the kitchen. Came from the attic. A faint, slow shifting noise, wood creaking above me. Something heavy moving slightly. I didn't know there was an attic. The cabin didn't look like it had one, but there must have been a small space above the ceiling. The thought of someone hiding up there made my skin crawl. I stared at the ceiling, almost expecting a board to shift. The noise came again, something scraping lightly, then something else like fabric brushing across wood. I sat up slowly, holding the flashlight tightly. My hand shook. The attic hatch was in the small hallway between the main room and the bathroom. I hadn't looked at it closely before. It was a simple square panel with no lock. I waited for the noise to stop. Didn't. It grew softer, like whoever or whatever was up there was trying to move quietly. Then it stopped all at once. The sudden silence made things worse. I stood there listening for any sign of movement. After several minutes of silence, I backed into the corner of the room and stayed awake until dawn. When the sun finally lit the cabin, I checked the attic hatch carefully. Dust had fallen around the edges. The hatch was slightly misaligned, like it had been moved from the inside. I didn't open it. I couldn't bring myself to. I had seen enough. I started packing immediately. My hands shook as I stuffed my things into bags. I felt exposed and watched even inside the cabin. I glanced at the windows every few seconds. When I stepped outside with the first bag, the cold morning air hit my face. The clearing looked different in the daylight. More disturbed. Pine needles pushed aside in long lines. Dirt kicked up. Footprints this time. Clear ones. Boot prints. Not old. Fresh. Leading toward the cabin. Leading away. Circling. I felt pressure in my chest as I set the bags in the car. I checked the woods constantly. The trees were still. But silence didn't mean safety. It just meant whoever had been there didn't want me to hear them. I went back to the cabin fast to grab the last bag. When I stepped inside, I froze. The attic hatch was open. Not wide, just a few inches, but enough. Enough to show it had been pushed from the inside. I didn't look up. I didn't wait. I grabbed my last bag, slammed the door behind me, and ran to the car. My hands shook so hard I dropped the keys twice before getting the engine started. As I pulled out of the clearing, I looked into the rearview mirror only once. Just one quick glance. But it was enough to see something move near the corner of the cabin. Something stepping back into the shadows. I drove until the cabin disappeared behind the trees. I didn't slow down. I didn't look back again. When I reached the main road miles later, my hands were still shaking. I didn't stop until I reached the nearest town. I went straight to the police station and reported everything. I told them about the noises, the dirt inside, the attic, the footprints, everything. They searched the cabin later that afternoon. When they called me back, they said the cabin was empty. Nobody found. No signs of forced entry. No signs of someone living in the woods. But they did find something in the attic. An old sleeping bag, empty food wrappers, a small pile of clothes, and a spot on the attic floor where the dust was cleared away in the shape of a body lying down. Like someone had spent nights directly above me, listening to me move, breathing quietly while I slept below them. They said the dust patterns suggested someone had left recently, not long before they arrived. Standing there in the station hearing that, I felt a cold heaviness sink into my chest. I understood then that whoever had been in that cabin hadn't just been passing through. They weren't lost. They weren't confused. They had been living there for a long time, and they had been watching the cabin carefully long before I arrived. I thought leaving would end things, but even now, months later, I still wake at night sometimes because I think I hear the same slow steps outside my window. I tell myself it's nothing. I tell myself it's just old fear, but part of me knows better. Some people don't live in the woods to be left alone. Some people live there to hide, and some people look for anyone who comes too close. That cabin wasn't empty when I arrived. I just didn't understand that until I was already inside it. The ending, as clear as I can say it, is simple. I went to the cabin because my mind felt heavy, and I thought being alone would help me think clearly again. I had been carrying stress for months, the kind that slowly covers everything you do like a dull weight, and I thought a few quiet days away from the noise of the city would help. The cabin belonged to a friend who used it for hunting season, and he told me it stayed empty almost the entire year. He told me it was peaceful, deep inside the trees, far from any houses or traffic. That was exactly what I wanted. I wanted a place where I could breathe without hearing cars or people or phones ringing. I wanted silence that felt real, not silence created by putting headphones on. When I started driving toward the place, the road slowly changed from paved to rough gravel, and then from gravel to narrow tracks that felt like they had not been driven on in months. The further I drove, the more the trees closed in around the road. The branches on both sides grew so close that the sunlight barely reached the ground. I remember thinking that the road looked less like something meant for a car and more like something animals used. I drove slowly because the last thing I wanted was to get stuck or damage my car so far away from anything. There was no signal on my phone for almost an hour before I reached the cabin. When I pulled up, the cabin looked exactly like something you would expect in a forest nobody visited. The wood was dark and weathered. The windows were small. The door leaned a little to one side, as if the frame had shifted with age. There was a stack of cut firewood beside the wall, but it looked old, like it had been sitting there for years. Dry leaves were tucked between the pieces. I stepped out of the car, and the air hit me with this strange stillness. There were no bird sounds, no wind, nothing. Just a deep, heavy quiet that felt unnatural after so much time in the city. I remember standing there for a few seconds and feeling like I had stepped into some place where time moved differently, slower and heavier. Inside, the cabin was small but usable. There was one main room with a bed, a table, and a small kitchen area. A bathroom sat in the corner, and there was no electricity except for a small generator outside that my friend said barely worked. He told me not to rely on it, so I had brought lanterns and batteries, things I figured I would need. The inside smelled like old wood and dust. The floor creaked no matter how carefully I stepped. The windows looked out into thick trees that blocked most of the light. The place felt isolated in a way I wasn't used to, but I told myself this was exactly what I came for. On the first evening, nothing bad happened. I unpacked my things, set up the bed, ate a simple meal, and tried to relax. I walked around outside for a while, looking at the ground near the cabin. There were a few old footprints, but they were faded and soft like they had been made long ago. Probably my friend's prints from months earlier. The temperature dropped quickly as the sun went down, and I went back inside, locked the door, and tried to sleep. But the sleep was light and restless. Every small noise felt like it came from just outside the cabin. The branches tapping, the wood creaking, some distant snapping sound in the forest. I kept opening my eyes to look around the room even though I knew there was nothing in there. I kept feeling this strange tightness in my chest, a sense that the darkness outside was heavier than normal darkness. I forced myself to stay still and eventually slept for a few hours. The next morning, I stepped outside and found something unusual. On the ground, near the steps of the cabin, the dirt looked disturbed. It wasn't shaped like an animal print. It was more like something had been dragged lightly across the ground. A line like someone had drawn it with a stick. It started near the tree line and ended right at the bottom step of the cabin. I stood there staring at it, trying to understand why it bothered me so much. It wasn't deep. It didn't show heavy pressure. But something about the way it came straight toward the cabin made me feel uneasy. I told myself it was probably an animal carrying a branch or something, but the line was too straight, too intentional looking. I walked around to see if there were any other signs, but the ground was covered with leaves, and nothing else stood out. I tried not to think about it and spent the rest of the morning exploring the area a little. I didn't go far because the trees grew so thick that I felt like I could lose my sense of direction easily. The forest floor was soft and uneven. There were fallen logs everywhere, and the deeper areas looked darker even though the sun was shining. Later, when I came back, the line in the dirt bothered me again. I kept looking at it, wondering if I should smooth it out with my foot, just to see if something dragged across it again during the night. But I didn't. Something in me wanted to see if it would change on its own. Maybe I wanted confirmation that it was nothing. That night, I felt even more uneasy. The quiet outside wasn't peaceful anymore. Felt watchful. I kept checking the windows even though the glass reflected more of the room's darkness than anything outside. I could see only my own shape faintly in the reflection, and every time I looked too long, it made me feel nervous. I finally turned off the lantern to remove the reflection, but then the darkness felt worse. Pressed in, filling the cabin like something thick and heavy. I lay in bed, staring at the faint outline of the ceiling, trying to calm my breathing. I must have drifted into a light sleep because at some point I woke with a sudden feeling of alertness, like something had pulled me awake. I listened carefully but heard only silence. Yet something felt wrong. I stayed still, focusing on that feeling. Slowly, a soft sound came from outside, like something brushing lightly against the side of the cabin. A slow, dragging movement. It wasn't loud, but in the silence it felt sharp, like it cut into the air. I didn't move. I just stayed there breathing softly, trying not to make any noise. The sound lasted only a few seconds and then stopped completely. But once it stopped, the silence stayed broken in a strange way. It felt like something was still out there, still close, just not moving. I didn't sleep again until morning. When I finally stepped outside, the air felt colder than the day before. I looked immediately at the ground near the steps, and my stomach tightened. The line was deeper now. Not just deeper, it was fresh. The dirt was pushed aside sharply, like something had dragged through it during the night. The straight line was still pointed directly at the step. I stared at it for a long time. I knew I hadn't touched it. I knew the wind couldn't make something like that happen. And it didn't look like an animal trail. It looked deliberate. I walked to where the line started near the tree line. The starting point was different today. Yesterday it had been a few feet inside the trees. Today it was deeper, almost lost in the shadows where the trees grew closer together. I tried to follow it, but after a few steps the ground became too covered with leaves to see anything. The rest of the day, I tried to distract myself, but my eyes kept drifting to the woods, especially to the spot where the line came from. I kept imagining someone standing there in the trees at night, pulling a stick or something across the ground, drawing a line toward the cabin. The idea made my skin crawl. By evening, I had convinced myself I was just nervous because I wasn't used to being alone in the woods. Maybe it really was an animal. Maybe something dragged something at night. I kept trying to think of rational explanations. But no matter what I told myself, the uneasiness grew stronger. That night, I kept the lantern on longer. I didn't want to turn it off because the darkness in the cabin made everything worse. Eventually, though, the heat from the lantern bothered me, and I turned it off. As soon as the room went dark, The feeling of being watched came back stronger than before. I lay there listening for anything, but minutes passed in silence. I tried to force myself to sleep, but then the sound started again, a soft dragging noise. An animal, person, something stuck on the wind, but there was no wind. Nothing outside moved enough for branches to scrape the walls. And the sound didn't feel random. It felt deliberate, steady, slow, as if someone was walking around the cabin and running something along the wooden wall as they moved. My throat felt dry, and my hands were cold even under the blankets. I kept thinking about the scratches on the door and how fresh they looked earlier. Minutes passed, long, heavy minutes, and the sound finally stopped. I didn't sleep again that night. I stayed awake until the faint light of morning crept into the cabin. When I finally got up, my legs were stiff and my head felt heavy from staying frozen for so long. I didn't want to go outside, but I didn't want to stay inside either. When I finally forced myself out the door, the cold air hit me like a slap. I walked around the cabin slowly, scanning the walls. On the back wall, I noticed thin marks in the dirt, as if something had stepped repeatedly near the base of the structure. The ground looked slightly disturbed, but there were no clear footprints, just patches where the earth looked pressed down in irregular shapes. I checked the wall next. There were faint streaks on the wood, like something had been dragged along it. Maybe a stick, maybe a tool, maybe something else. They were long and thin, running from the back of the cabin toward the front. They hadn't been there yesterday. The sight made my stomach feel tight. I kept telling myself there had to be a logical explanation. Maybe falling branches. Maybe a wandering animal. Maybe I was overthinking everything because I wasn't used to this level of silence and isolation. But no matter how much I tried to explain it to myself, something about it felt wrong. The streaks were too straight, too even, and they stopped exactly near the corner of the cabin where the window was. I spent most of that day feeling unsettled. I walked around the area near the cabin, trying to see if there were any clear tracks or signs of an animal, but the ground didn't show anything clear. The forest was so still that even the sound of my own footsteps felt too loud. I kept turning around, expecting to see something behind me, but nothing was ever there. When I went back inside the cabin, the air felt heavier, as if the place itself remembered what happened during the night. I tried to distract myself by reading a book I brought, but every little sound made me snap my head up. The creaks in the floor felt louder. The ticking of the old wall clock felt sharper. As evening approached again, I felt a tightness growing in my chest. I didn't want the night to come. I didn't want to be inside the cabin again, lying awake in the dark, waiting for something to brush against the walls. When darkness finally settled around the cabin, it felt complete. A thick darkness that swallowed everything outside. The slope behind the cabin looked like a vast pit of black. Even the porch light barely reached the first few feet. I turned off all the lights inside except the small lamp near the bed. I didn't want to be in total darkness, but I also didn't want bright lights that would make it impossible to see outside the window. I tried to stay awake as long as I could, but the exhaustion from the previous night made my eyelids heavy. At some point, I drifted into a light, uneasy sleep. I don't know how long I slept before I woke up again, but when I did, the cabin felt freezing. I pulled the blankets tighter, and then I heard it. A slow, heavy step. This time, it wasn't brushing on the wall. It was the sound of weight on the wooden porch. Another step. The wood creaked under it. My body went stiff. My breathing stopped. I felt my heart pounding so hard it hurt. Another step. It was right outside the front door. Then silence. I didn't move. I didn't blink. I didn't even swallow. I just stared into the darkness of the room. My eyes barely adjusted enough to make out the faint outline of the door. I waited for another step, but nothing happened. I kept thinking about the distance between the bed and the door, about how thin the cabin walls were, about how empty the forest was, about how nobody knew I was here except the owner of the cabin, whose number I couldn't call because there was no signal inside. Minutes passed, long enough that my muscles began to ache. I felt like anything I did, any movement, even a breath too loud, would give me away. At some point, the cold feeling in the room shifted. The air felt tense again, the same way it did last night, like something outside was listening, watching. Then, the most quiet sound of all, a slow shift of weight against the porch boards, like someone adjusting their position silently. My chest felt tight, and I had to force myself not to gasp. I stayed frozen, waiting, praying for morning. The sound didn't return, but I didn't sleep again. I waited in that same position until the darkness outside finally lightened, turning into the dull gray of dawn. When I stepped outside later, the porch boards had new marks, faint but visible, where something heavy had stood. And that was only the beginning. Minutes felt like hours. The intruder moved toward the kitchen. I could hear cabinets opening and closing, drawers being searched. I stayed still, hoping they wouldn't hear me. Then I heard something that made my stomach drop, a soft laugh, almost under their breath. I realized this person had no fear. They weren't just looking for something. They were enjoying it. They were in my space, invading it, and it was a game for them. The thought made me feel sick, but it also sharpened my focus. I had to survive. I had to be smart. I had to be ready. The intruder moved toward the bedroom door. I could hear them pause, listening. My mind raced. I thought of the fireplace. The logs were mostly burnt down, but there were still some embers. If I could tip the fireplace poker toward them, maybe I could scare them long enough to escape. Or maybe I could strike with the knife. I weighed my options, knowing any mistake could be fatal. My body was tense, every nerve alert, every sense heightened. I could smell the faint musk of the intruder, the cold metal of their knife, the sweat. I could hear their movements, each step calculated, cautious. They were skilled. They were patient. They had done this before. Suddenly, the door handle rattled. They were trying the bedroom door. I braced myself, knife in hand. The door shook slightly. I pushed the bed harder against it, but I knew it wouldn't hold if they tried long enough. The handle turned again, slower this time. I waited, barely daring to breathe, and then it stopped. Silence. My ears strained. Had they given up? Or were they waiting for me to move? I didn't dare find out. I stayed pressed against the wall, knife ready, waiting, my body screaming in tension and fear. Time passed. Slowly, almost painfully, I realized the intruder had moved away. The faint sounds of movement faded. I stayed where I was, listening, until the first light of dawn began to filter through the windows. The moonlight faded, shadows softened, and the forest outside became visible again. I cautiously moved toward the bedroom door, peeking out. The living room was empty. Drawers had been ransacked, my belongings scattered, but there was no sign of the intruder. They had left, or at least I hoped they had. I stayed still for a long while, checking every corner, every possible hiding spot. Finally, the cabin felt quiet again. I knew I couldn't stay there. I grabbed my bag, packed quickly but carefully, taking only essentials: my wallet, phone, knife, and a small bag of clothes. I left everything else behind, not daring to risk another encounter. I opened the door slowly and stepped outside. The forest was bright in the morning sun. Birds calling, wind rustling the leaves. Felt almost surreal, the calm after the terror. I ran down the dirt path to my car, glancing over my shoulder constantly. I didn't see anyone. No one had followed me. My hands shook so badly I could barely start the car. I drove without stopping, down the winding forest road, my heart still racing, adrenaline still coursing through me. I didn't look back. When I finally reached the nearest town, I went straight to the police station. I reported everything, gave a full description of the cabin, the intruder, and what had happened. They listened carefully, taking notes, promising to send officers to check the area. I realized then that I was lucky, very lucky. Could have been so much worse. Someone could have been hurt or worse, but I had survived. I had stayed alert, stayed quiet, and stayed alive. In the weeks after, I didn't return to the cabin. I found another place for solitude, somewhere safer, where there were neighbors nearby. But the memory stayed with me. The fear, the helplessness, the knowledge that someone could invade your life without warning, and you would have no one to turn to. It made me careful, vigilant, and I realized that the forest, beautiful and peaceful as it could be, was also unpredictable and dangerous. I learned that safety is never guaranteed, that people can be cruel and bold, and that survival depends on your awareness, your preparation, and your ability to stay calm under pressure. I had faced real danger in that cabin, and I had come out alive. I had survived because I didn't panic, because I acted carefully, and because I trusted my instincts. The cabin no longer felt like a place of peace, but it had taught me something invaluable. Vigilance can save your life, and sometimes, even in the most beautiful places, danger waits quietly, patiently, and without warning. That night, the intruder had come. That morning, I left, and that was the end of it, clear, real, and unforgettable. I checked the cabin thoroughly. Nothing was missing or moved, but the sense of being watched clung to me like a shadow. I spent the day keeping busy, chopping some firewood, tidying the small cabin, and walking short loops around the clearing to remind myself I wasn't going crazy. The sun didn't rise high, filtered as it was through the thick canopy, and the shadows seemed longer and more oppressive than I remembered. That night, the footsteps returned, louder this time, circling the cabin slowly, carefully, almost tauntingly. I grabbed a hatchet from the kitchen, gripping it tightly, and waited in the corner of the main room near the stove. Hours passed. The sounds moved closer. My stomach twisted in fear. Every time the wind shifted, it felt like it carried whispers. I told myself it was just the branches rubbing together, just the wind, but my instincts screamed otherwise. Around 2 a.m., I saw movement outside the window, a shadow flitting past the trees. My breath caught. I switched on a small camping lantern and set it near the window, illuminating the clearing. The shadow stopped at the edge of the light. I could see the outline of a person crouched low, holding something long and thin, maybe a stick or a metal pipe. My mind raced. I could stay put and hope they left, or I could try to escape. I knew the road was too far to reach without being seen, and I had no signal on my phone. The nearest neighbor was miles away. Panic mixed with calculation. I decided to secure myself inside. I checked the windows, making sure they were latched, then used heavy furniture to block the door. My heart pounded in my chest. I stayed awake all night, the shadow never leaving the edge of the forest completely, always just beyond reach, always watching. Morning came, gray and cold. I could see footprints all around the cabin now, some almost directly beneath the windows, scuff marks where someone had tested the door. My fear turned to a careful, focused determination. I would leave, but I needed a plan. I gathered supplies: food, water, a first aid kit, and my backpack. I left the back window slightly open to escape if necessary. Then I sat and watched. For hours, I observed the forest. Eventually, the shadow disappeared. I didn't wait any longer. I used the pre-cut firewood to barricade the cabin more thoroughly, then slipped out the back window, keeping low and moving as quietly as possible. My goal was to reach the road, not to confront whoever had been circling the cabin. I moved slowly, checking over my shoulder constantly. Every snapping branch made my pulse spike. It took hours, but I finally reached the main road. My legs ached, my body trembled, but I made it. I walked along the road until a car approached. I flagged it down, and the driver agreed to give me a ride to the nearest town. When I finally had a cell signal, I called the police and reported the incident. They came back with me to the cabin a few days later. Tracks had been found in the area. Someone had been camping nearby, hiding in the trees, watching the cabin for days. They were gone when authorities arrived, leaving no trace except the footprints and a few abandoned belongings. The cabin was abandoned permanently after that. I never returned, but I kept the experience close in memory. The way isolation can magnify fear, the way a forest can be both beautiful and threatening, and the unnerving realization that someone could be so close, observing you without being seen. That weekend, I learned that sometimes the scariest things aren't supernatural. They are human, patient, and quietly dangerous. And in that knowledge, I found a strange sense of relief, because once you understand the threat, you can respect it, prepare for it, and survive it. Even now, years later, When I see isolated cabins or walk through dense forests, I feel the memory of that weekend. The silence, the shadows, and the knowing that some dangers don't announce themselves. They wait, and only careful attention will keep you safe. I had been planning this trip for months. The idea of being alone in the woods, far away from the constant noise of the city, was irresistible. My friends had warned me about the isolation, the bears, the broken-down roads, the occasional criminal in the woods, but I brushed it off. I thought I was careful, smart, experienced enough. I had stayed in cabins before, camped in the wilderness, hiked alone. I was confident in my ability to handle whatever came. I drove up a winding mountain road, my car struggling a little against the steep incline, past dense forests that seemed older than any city I had known. The sun was starting to dip below the mountains when I finally saw the cabin. It was a small, weathered structure with wooden siding that had darkened with age. The windows were dusty but intact, and smoke was curling lazily from the chimney. From a distance, it looked almost picturesque, like a scene from a postcard. Pulling up to the gravel driveway, I noticed that the area around the cabin was unusually quiet. Not a bird chirping, not a squirrel rustling. Even the wind seemed hesitant, moving through the trees in a way that felt more like a whisper than a breeze. My first thought was that the forest had simply settled into the evening, but there was a nagging feeling in my stomach I couldn't shake. I unloaded my bag and took my first look inside the cabin. It was rustic but serviceable. A small kitchen, a stove with some leftover wood stacked beside it, a fridge that still worked, a table with chairs, and a single bedroom at the back. There was an old couch in the corner and a pile of blankets and pillows on it. Everything smelled faintly of mildew and smoke, but it wasn't unpleasant. It had that old cabin smell. Dust, wood, and something faintly organic that I could never quite place. The first night was quiet. I lit a fire, ate some canned food, and sat watching the flames dance. Outside, the forest was dark and still. I listened to the occasional crack of a branch, maybe a deer moving, maybe just the wind. But there was one sound that I couldn't identify. A faint scraping, like nails across wood, coming from the back of the cabin, or maybe the side. I froze. It lasted only a few seconds and then stopped. I told myself it was probably just the old wood settling, or maybe a raccoon on the roof. I tried to relax and went to bed early, leaving the window cracked just enough for air. That night, I slept fitfully. I kept waking up, convinced I heard footsteps outside, even though I could see the moonlight through the small windows. Around 3 a.m., I woke to the sound of something scratching at the door. My heart slammed in my chest. I grabbed the baseball bat I had brought along for safety and crept toward the door. Peering through the peephole, I saw nothing but darkness. The scratching stopped. I waited, tense, listening. After a long minute, I convinced myself it had been a branch brushing against the door, or maybe a raccoon. I went back to bed, though sleep was impossible after that. The next day, I decided to go for a walk to clear my head. The woods were thick, the trees towering and close together. I could barely see more than a few feet in any direction. I followed a faint trail, and after about 20 minutes, I realized I had no idea where I was. I had intended to make a loop, but the path seemed to twist and turn unpredictably. There were no markings, no familiar sights. My heart started to race as I realized that getting lost here would be easy, and help would be hours away, if I could even get a signal to call anyone. When I finally returned to the cabin, I was shaken, but I told myself that being alone in the woods could make anyone feel paranoid. I needed to stay rational. That night, I double-checked all the locks and closed the windows completely. I made sure the fire was high enough to illuminate most of the room, thinking the bright light might keep me safe. The following day, I went out again, this time better prepared with a backpack, water, and a map I had printed from home. I planned to follow a small creek I had seen from the cabin. It was beautiful, the water sparkling, the forest alive with birds and insects, but the feeling of being watched never left me. Every rustle of leaves, every snapping twig felt like it was happening right behind me, even when I knew I was alone. By late afternoon, I returned to the cabin to find something that made my blood run cold. The door was slightly ajar. I was sure I had locked it. Inside, nothing appeared out of place at first glance. The kitchen counters were clear. My backpack was still in the corner. But then I noticed small scratches along the inside of the doorframe, faint but definitely there. My mind raced. Someone had been here while I was out. I spent the rest of the evening barricading the cabin as best I could. I moved the furniture against the doors, stacked heavy firewood across the back entrance, and kept the lights low. I didn't sleep well that night. Every noise, the wind, the cracking of the wood, the hoot of an owl, made my stomach twist. I stayed up until the fire burned down to embers, clutching the bat and listening. By the 5th day, I could no longer ignore the signs. The door had been nudged open slightly, something that hadn't happened before. Items in the kitchen were out of place. I knew someone had been inside while I was away. Panic set in, but I forced myself to think logically. I had a fire poker, a small hatchet, and a knife. I could defend myself if necessary. I also had a plan. Stay inside, make as much noise as possible if anyone tried to approach, and leave at first light. I prepared food, stacked firewood near the doors and windows, and made sure everything was ready. Sleep was impossible. I dozed only briefly, waking every time a noise made me jump. My body felt tense, my mind on edge, and every shadow seemed alive. The 6th day arrived, gray and heavy with fog. The mist hung over the clearing, making the cabin look like a small dark speck in the middle of a gray ocean. I didn't go outside. I stayed inside, pacing and watching, listening. The fog muted sounds, but the silence was almost worse. It felt like the world had shrunk to this small cabin, and outside was an endless void where danger could be hiding anywhere. At one point, I saw movement through the fog, something at the edge of the clearing, barely visible. I couldn't tell if it was human or animal, but my instinct told me to stay still. I held my breath, waiting. After a while, it disappeared. I don't know if it had ever been there or if my mind was playing tricks, but I couldn't take chances. That night, I barricaded myself as best as I could. I placed heavy furniture against the doors, stacked firewood by the windows, and stayed near the fireplace with my knife in hand. I felt cornered, trapped, yet oddly alert. Every sound outside felt like a threat, every shadow a potential intruder. By the 7th day, I realized I couldn't stay any longer. I had to leave, even if it meant driving through the forest in poor light and fog. I waited until first light, listening to the forest, waiting for a break in the fog. When it finally seemed safe, I grabbed my supplies, checked my car, and stepped outside. The air was cold and damp, fog clinging to my clothes. The clearing seemed empty, but I moved quickly, checking over my shoulder constantly. I made it to the car, got inside, and started the engine. The moment I turned onto the dirt road, I felt a kind of relief I hadn't known I could feel. The road was rough, but I drove carefully, never letting myself relax. Every sound made me tense, but the more I descended, the less the forest seemed like a trap and more like a place I had survived. The fear didn't go away completely, but I felt a small, growing confidence in my ability to protect myself, to survive even when I was completely alone. I finally reached the main highway, and as I drove toward town, the forest disappeared behind me. The fear started to fade, replaced by exhaustion and relief. I checked my phone and finally got a signal. No messages, no calls, but I didn't care. I had survived. I realized that the real terror wasn't ghosts or monsters. It was isolation, the unknown, and the way being truly alone could make every sound, every shadow, feel like danger. I also realized that I had learned something about myself. I could stay calm under pressure, make careful decisions, and face fear without panicking. It wasn't pleasant, but it was empowering. When I reached the town, I pulled into a small diner, ordered food, and sat down, letting the warmth and the light fill me. I could hear the faint hum of conversation, the clatter of dishes, and the low background music. It was a stark contrast to the silence of the forest, but it felt safe. I ate slowly, savoring the sense of normalcy. Later, I stayed the night at a cheap motel, slept in a real bed with a lockable door, and finally felt completely safe. The forest and the cabin were behind me, a memory of fear and solitude, but also a memory of survival. The experience left me with a strange sense of gratitude. I had been terrified, yes, but I had also faced it alone, without anyone to rely on but myself. I had learned how to stay alert, how to trust my instincts, and how to move carefully in the unknown. And although I knew I would probably never return to a place so isolated, I also knew that I could. I had survived, and that was enough. The next morning, I debated leaving, but the nearest town was miles away. My car was parked at the edge of the gravel driveway, and I wasn't sure I could navigate the steep, winding mountain road in the dark. So I stayed. I spent the day cleaning the cabin, checking for other signs of intrusion. That's when I noticed something else. Small footprints in the dust near the windows. Human footprints. I was careful to step around them so I could examine them, measuring them against my own shoes. Too small to be mine, and they led from the edge of the trees to the window, then back again. My mind refused to accept it at first. Maybe it was an animal, but no animal left prints shaped like shoes. The afternoon sun was waning, and I felt trapped. My options were limited. I couldn't call for help. The signal here was terrible. I couldn't leave easily, not safely. The thought of being alone in a cabin with a potential intruder lurking outside was suffocating. I decided to stay inside, keep the fire going, and wait for nightfall to pass. That night was worse than the first. I heard the same scratching and scraping at the door and windows repeatedly. I even heard a faint voice calling my name, but low, almost a whisper carried on the wind. My rational mind told me it was impossible, but my instincts screamed danger. I didn't open the door. I didn't even peek through the windows. I stayed in the bedroom, clutching the bat, listening, and praying that whoever was out there would go away. Morning came slowly. Exhaustion had taken over, but I was too tense to relax. I decided I had to do something about the intruder. I looked around the cabin for anything I could use to secure it better. I found an old padlock and chain in the kitchen drawer, which I used to reinforce the main door. I moved furniture to block the windows further, creating a barrier that would take time for anyone to breach. I also found an old hunting rifle in the corner, covered in dust. I checked it, made sure it was loaded. At least now I had some means of defense if necessary. That afternoon, I heard movement outside again. Footsteps around the perimeter of the cabin, slow and deliberate. I didn't move. I stayed low, hidden behind the barricade I had built, keeping the rifle close. I could see shadows moving across the walls as someone walked past the windows. Every muscle in my body was tense. I didn't breathe. I didn't dare make a sound. Hours passed. The footsteps finally stopped sometime around sunset. I was too exhausted to react. I stayed awake all night, barely sleeping, listening for any sign of the intruder. The morning light was the first relief I had felt since I arrived. I knew I couldn't stay here any longer. I had to get help. I packed the essentials, the rifle, the bat, my bag, and left through the back of the cabin. I took a deep breath of the cold mountain air, my body trembling. I had to navigate the forest carefully, using the creek as a guide. Every step I took, every branch I pushed aside, I listened for movement. I stayed as quiet as I could, avoiding any open areas. Hours later, I finally made it to the main road. Relief washed over me. I saw a car approaching and waved frantically. The driver stopped. I explained everything in short, disjointed sentences, pointing back toward the cabin. They called the authorities, who arrived within an hour. The police searched the cabin and the surrounding woods. They found evidence that someone had been living in makeshift shelters nearby. Old food wrappers, scraps of clothing, and other items were scattered around. They had been observing the cabin, watching me for days, but apparently never tried to approach directly. The scratches, the footprints, the noises, all of it had been attempts to intimidate me, to make me leave or panic. I left the woods that day, exhausted and shaken but alive. The cabin, which had once seemed like a peaceful escape, had turned into a place of fear and uncertainty. I never returned, and I never stayed alone in the wilderness again. The experience taught me something about isolation, about human danger, and about the need for vigilance. I had survived, but just barely. Months later, I still remember the smell of the cabin, the cold of the night, the sound of footsteps in the darkness. I know now that even in the quietest, most remote places, danger can be very real, very human, and very close. I learned to respect the woods, yes, but also to respect the people who might be hiding in them. I kept the rifle, the bat, and the lessons with me. I sleep better now, but I will never forget that cabin, or the fear that made me truly understand what it means to be alone and vulnerable in the wilderness. I had been planning the weekend for weeks. The cabin was tucked deep in the forest, far from the road, far from anyone, and I wanted the solitude. It was early autumn, the air crisp, the trees a riot of red and gold, and the light fading earlier each day. The first few hours of my drive had been beautiful, the kind of scenery that made me feel like I had stepped into another world, a world completely separate from the noise and chaos of the city. The cabin was small, made of logs with a steep roof, and it smelled of wood and old pine. I had rented it online, the pictures making it look perfect, remote, and peaceful. I was sure I would have the place to myself. When I arrived, I parked the car on the narrow dirt path outside, under the shadow of tall pines. The sun was slipping behind the horizon, leaving long fingers of orange light on the ground. I carried my bag inside, noting the quiet. There were no sounds of traffic, no voices, only the wind brushing through the branches and the occasional distant call of a bird. Inside, the cabin was small but well kept. There was a living area with a stone fireplace, a small kitchen with all the basics, a bedroom with a narrow bed, and a bathroom that smelled faintly of mildew but was clean enough. I unpacked my things, laid out a simple dinner of canned soup and bread, and lit a small fire in the fireplace. The warmth felt good against the chill in the air. As I ate, I watched the forest outside through the window. The shadows of the trees were stretching long, and the fading light made the world look almost unreal. I felt a deep satisfaction at being alone, being away from everything. I told myself I was ready for the weekend, ready for silence, for reading, for walking, for nothing but myself and the forest. After dinner, I cleaned up and prepared for bed. I kept the fire small, the logs burning slowly, casting a flickering glow. I checked the windows and doors, making sure everything was locked. The cabin felt safe. I crawled under the blanket, listening to the forest settle around me. Somewhere far off, a branch cracked. I paused, straining my ears, but the sound didn't repeat. I told myself it was just an animal, probably a deer. I tried to sleep, but the sounds of the night seemed louder here, more intense. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves, made my stomach tighten. I told myself again I was imagining things. The forest was alive. It made sounds. That was all. I finally drifted into a light sleep, only to wake a few hours later with the feeling that something was wrong. The air was colder, the fire had died down to embers, and the cabin was dark except for the faint moonlight coming through the windows. I felt a strange tension, like the room was holding its breath. At first, I thought it was just me, paranoia settling in. But then I heard it. A creak, soft but deliberate, coming from the living room. Someone was there. My heart slammed. I froze, listening. Another creak. Footsteps. Slow, cautious, but heavy enough to be human. Someone was inside my cabin. I couldn't think clearly. My mind raced. I had no cell signal, no way to call anyone. The nearest neighbor was miles away. Panic hit in waves. I looked around for something I could use, anything, a kitchen knife, a heavy pan. I remembered the small hunting knife I had left in my bag. I grabbed it, holding it tightly, knuckles white, and stayed in the bedroom, listening. The footsteps moved closer. I could hear the faint scrape of shoes on the wooden floor. My chest hurt, my stomach knotted. I didn't breathe, barely dared to move. The intruder was inside my cabin, somewhere, and I was trapped. I thought of the windows. They were small, some high off the ground, not easily escapable. The door to the bedroom was solid wood, but it had no lock. I quietly edged the bed against it, hoping it would slow someone down if they tried to come in. The footsteps stopped, then I heard something being shifted. A drawer opened, then closed. They were looking for something. I didn't understand why anyone would come here. The cabin was alone, miles from anything. Maybe they had been following the road, had seen the car. I tried to keep my mind focused, planning what I would do if they found me. I had to stay quiet. The intruder moved again. I could hear faint breathing now, slow, deliberate. I held the knife tightly, my body pressed against the wall, listening to every sound. I knew that if they came in, it would be a fight for survival. I couldn't scream, no one would hear me. I couldn't run, not without being seen. The sound of my own heartbeat was deafening. I told myself to stay calm, but my hands shook uncontrollably. I tried to make myself small, make myself invisible, but in my mind, I could see them, a figure moving through my cabin, watching, searching. I prayed they would leave. I prayed I wasn't found. I did not plan to stay alone in a cabin deep inside the mountains, but I wanted a break from everything in my life. My work had been eating me alive, and my sleep had been collapsing for months. I had been waking up tired every morning, sitting in front of my computer like a machine that had passed its expiry date long ago. I kept telling myself that a short trip away from the noise of the city would help me breathe again. That was why I booked the cabin online without thinking much about it. The pictures were simple. The location seemed remote but peaceful. I thought the quiet would help me reset. I did not think anything strange would happen out there. I did not think I would end up in a situation where I had to calm my own heartbeat with my bare hands at times. I went there thinking I would rest. Instead, I learned how it feels when your surroundings react to you in ways you cannot immediately explain, when every sound becomes a warning, when every shadow begins to hold weight. I reached the cabin in the late afternoon. The sky was pale blue, and thin clouds drifted above the mountain line. The air was sharper than what I was used to in the city. My lungs burned slightly every time I inhaled, and the cold stuck to the inside of my nose. The cabin looked exactly like the photos. Small, wooden, almost too plain. There was a narrow porch with 2 steps, a single window on the front wall, and a roof that slanted enough to let heavy snow slide off during winter. The area around it looked wild and untouched. Tall pines surrounded the place in a thick circle, their branches forming a canopy that filtered the sunlight into long, thin beams. The ground was uneven, covered with old needles, broken branches, soft patches of moss, and scattered stones. Inside the cabin, everything was basic. A small bed with a thin mattress, a wooden table with a single chair, a tiny kitchen area with a metal sink and a gas stove that looked like it had been used by a dozen hikers before me. A bathroom that was barely more than a stall with a drain. There was also a fireplace that filled the air with a faint smell of old wood and ash. The place felt empty, but it also felt like someone had been there recently. The floorboards were clean, and the blanket on the bed was spread too neatly. I told myself the cleaning service must have prepared the place before I arrived. I unpacked slowly. I folded my clothes and placed them on the chair. I set my phone, charger, flashlight, and small pocket knife on the table. I put my shoes in the corner next to the door because I wanted to keep the floors clean. I checked the window latch to make sure it worked. When I touched it, I noticed it was slightly loose, as if someone had been opening it repeatedly. Still, I pushed it down and checked it again. It held. I told myself that maybe the wood had just warped a bit due to cold weather. I tried to enjoy the quiet. I made tea with the small stove and sat on the bed, letting the steam warm my face. The silence was deep, almost too deep. I could hear my own breathing louder than usual. I could hear the ticking of the cooling stove. I could even hear small movements outside, but I assumed they were just animals. The forest was full of life, and it made sense that tiny creatures were moving through leaves and branches. When the sun started to set, the inside of the cabin turned darker faster than I expected. The trees blocked most of the light, and I had to use the small lamp on the table. Its warm yellow glow made the shadows darker around the edges of the room. I kept telling myself to relax. I had come here to rest. The first strange thing happened that same night. I woke up after midnight, I did not know what time it was exactly because the cabin had no clock and my phone was charging on the table across the room. But it was dark, and the only light came from the moon shining faintly through the window. I woke up because I heard something, soft footsteps outside, moving slowly around the cabin. My heart began to beat hard in my chest. I stared at the ceiling, trying to convince myself it was an animal. There were plenty of animals in the forest. Could have been a deer walking near the porch. Could have been a raccoon or a fox. But the steps sounded too heavy for a raccoon and too controlled for a deer. They had a slow, deliberate rhythm, like something or someone was trying not to make noise. I stayed still. I listened for a long time. The steps stopped. Then I heard nothing for several minutes. I waited until my chest stopped tightening. When the silence continued for long enough, I managed to fall asleep again. The next morning, I tried to shake it off. I kept telling myself I had imagined the footsteps, or maybe they had belonged to some big animal. I made breakfast, ate slowly, and went outside to take a short walk. The air was cold, but the sunlight made everything look normal again. I walked around the cabin, pretending I was just stretching my legs. I scanned the ground without trying to look like I was searching for anything. The soil was soft enough to keep footprints, but I did not see anything clear. The pine needles had fallen heavily during the night, covering the ground. If there had been prints, they were gone. Still, something bothered me. On the back side of the cabin, near the base of the wall, I found a small strip of bark that looked like it had been scraped off recently. I crouched down and touched it. The wood underneath was lighter than the rest of the wall, which meant it had been exposed recently. It was not a big scrape, but it looked like something had brushed or pressed against the wall with force. I started thinking about the footsteps again. I tried to push the thought away. It was too early in my stay to start feeling nervous. I went back inside and spent the day reading, writing, and making simple meals. I tried to stay calm. The daylight made everything feel manageable. But as the sun moved behind the trees again, I felt a new kind of tension building inside me. I was afraid of the night before it even arrived. And when the night came, it proved me right. This time, I woke up to a different sound. It was softer but more controlled. Something was brushing lightly against the cabin wall outside, moving slowly along it. The sound traveled from one side of the cabin to the other, like someone was sliding their hand or some object across the wooden surface. I stayed frozen under the blanket. My breathing was shallow. My fingers were pressed tight against the mattress. My ears locked onto the sound, following it as it circled the cabin. My thoughts began to spiral. I kept telling myself it had to be an animal rubbing against the wall, but deep down, I did not believe it. Then the brushing stopped, and I heard another sound, a soft creak near the window latch, the same latch I had tested earlier that day. I felt a cold wave pass through my body. I did not move. I stared at the window from my bed. The latch did not move visually, but I heard something faint, like pressure being applied against the glass. Then silence. I did not sleep again that night. I stayed awake until the first light pushed through the trees. When the sun rose, I got up slowly, my muscles stiff from staying still for so long. I approached the window to check it. The latch was in place, but when I touched it, I noticed it was looser than before, as if it had been lifted slightly during the night, then pushed back down carelessly. That was when I realized something wasn't just weird anymore. Something was wrong. I stepped outside despite the fear still sitting heavy in my chest. I needed to see the area in daylight. I needed to know if I was imagining things. Behind the cabin, near the same spot where I had seen the scraped bark, I noticed something else. Pine needles pushed aside in a narrow, uneven pattern. Not footprints, but signs of movement. The earth underneath was disturbed. Not deeply, but noticeably if you were looking closely. On the far side of the cabin, near a group of thick bushes, I found something that made my stomach tighten so hard I felt slightly sick. A small piece of fabric, dark, torn, caught on one of the branches. It looked like part of a jacket or old shirt. The edges were frayed like it had been ripped. Could have been there for days or weeks or months, but the color didn't look faded. It looked fresh. I tried to distract myself. I sharpened a small knife I kept for hiking. I checked the locks on the door twice. I kept the fire burning stronger than the night before, letting more warmth fill the cabin. Hours passed. Nothing happened. I started to think maybe last night had been nothing more than my mind being too aware of every detail. But then I heard it again. A slow sound, not far away this time, somewhere near the tree line. I held my breath and listened. The sound repeated, slow and rhythmic, something moving through the grass. I stood and moved closer to the window, but I didn't get too close. I didn't want something to see me through the glass if it was looking. The sound grew clearer, something walking toward the cabin. Slow, heavy, careful. I felt my body tighten. The air in the cabin felt thin. The steps came closer and then stopped. Right outside, I stood completely still. I could hear my heartbeat echoing in my ears. The cabin felt like it was holding its breath with me. Then I heard something I didn't expect. A faint scrape against the wall. Not clawing, not scratching. More like something brushing against the wood, feeling its surface. Then another scrape, a bit higher up, like it was moving its hand or body along the wall. I backed away slowly, keeping my eyes on the door even though the sound came from the side. The fire crackled softly, the only warm sound in the whole cabin. The scraping moved toward the window, slow and deliberate. I stared at the window, waiting for something to appear, but the glass stayed dark. Then the sound stopped, and everything went silent again. I waited there for several minutes. My legs felt stiff, but I didn't sit down. I just listened. The silence stretched on and on. I started to think maybe whatever it was had walked away. But then I heard a new sound. A soft pressure on the doorknob. Something touching it. Not turning it, not trying to force it. Just touching it. Testing it. The metal made a faint clicking sound. I stared at the door, feeling my throat tighten. The pressure on the doorknob stopped. Then came the slow sound of steps moving away. The movement went around the side of the cabin again, then into the grass behind it, and then farther until the sound faded completely. I didn't move until long after everything went silent. I didn't sleep at all. I stayed awake all night, sitting near the stove with the knife in my hand, staring at the door and window until my eyes burned. Every few minutes, I thought I heard something outside, but I couldn't tell if it was real or if my mind was too tired. When morning came, I felt weak from how long I had stayed awake. I opened the door carefully and stepped outside. The cold morning air hit me hard. I walked around the cabin slowly. This time I saw more signs. The grass near the wall was pressed down again, but in a wider area. And near the window, I saw faint marks on the wood. Long, thin smudges, like something had dragged a hand across it. There were no clear fingerprints, no footprints, nothing that I could use to identify anything. But it was enough to make my stomach twist. I walked toward the tree line, but not too far. I looked down at the ground. There were disturbances in the grass leading away from the cabin. They weren't clear tracks, just areas where the grass looked bent in a path that led into the deeper woods. I followed it for a few steps, then stopped. The forest looked too dark, too quiet. I didn't want to go farther. When I returned to the cabin, I stood there for a long time, thinking. I didn't want to stay another night. I didn't want to wait and hear those sounds again. The idea of another long, dark night made my whole body tense. My instincts were telling me to leave, but part of me felt stubborn. I felt like if I left now, something would follow me. Not literally, not like a ghost. Just the memory of not knowing what was out there. I didn't want that hanging over me. I didn't want to carry that fear home and wonder forever. So I convinced myself to stay one more night, even though everything in me felt wrong about the idea. The day dragged on slowly. I tried to keep myself busy again, but nothing helped. Every sound in the forest made me turn my head sharply. Even the wind moving through the leaves made me flinch. I felt watched the whole day. When evening came, the sky turned dark even faster than the night before. Thick clouds covered the moon, making everything almost pitch black. The cold felt deeper. I lit the stove early and sat near it, trying to calm myself. Hours passed with nothing happening. The silence felt heavier. I kept staring at the door, waiting for the first sound. Then, sometime deep into the night, I heard it. The slow steps. But this time, there was more than one set. I froze. My chest tightened. I listened hard. At least 2 sets of steps, maybe 3. Moving in the grass. Surrounding the cabin. My hands started shaking. I held the knife tighter, but it felt useless compared to whatever was outside. The steps moved closer, slow and controlled, like they knew exactly where I was. The first sound came to the left side of the cabin, the second at the back wall, the third near the front. I could hear breathing this time, faint but steady, human breathing but deeper, more controlled. I didn't move. Something pressed against the wall. Another scrape, then another coming from a different side. They were touching the cabin again, but this time from multiple directions. Then came the slow pressure on the door, the same as the night before but firmer, testing it, feeling the weight of it. I stepped back slowly, keeping my eyes on the door. My heartbeat felt like it was shaking my ribs. The doorknob moved, just a tiny motion, enough to make the metal click. Then it moved again, a slow attempt to twist it. My legs felt weak. My throat felt dry. The door stayed shut, but the doorknob kept shifting slightly, like someone was testing how much force it would take. Then it stopped. The next sound came from the window, something brushing against the glass. A faint tapping, slow and steady. I stepped farther back. My breath felt too loud. The tapping stopped, and then everything went silent again. Minutes passed. Then more dragging sounds came from behind the cabin. More slow movement in the grass. Something large shifted weight. Then another set of steps moved toward the far wall. Then the breathing started again. This time closer. I backed into the corner near the stove, holding the knife, feeling the heat against my back. I couldn't do anything except wait, listen, and hope the door held. After a long time that felt like hours, the sounds slowly faded. The steps moved away from the cabin, one set at a time. First one direction, then another. Eventually the forest swallowed all the noise again. I stayed awake until the sun came up. When morning arrived, I packed everything as fast as I could. I stepped outside to load my car and felt my body tense with every step. I kept checking the tree line even when I didn't mean to. I walked around the cabin one last time. More grass was bent, more smudges on the wood, and near the door, I saw something I hadn't seen before. A faint mark on the ground, wide and deep, like a heel had pressed into the dirt. It wasn't a normal footprint. It looked like someone had stepped heavily, twisting their weight. I knelt down and stared at it for a long time. My breathing felt tight in my chest. I stood up, grabbed the last bag, and locked the cabin door even though I knew it wouldn't matter. I got into my car and started the engine. The sound of the engine felt like safety. I backed up, turned the car around, and drove toward the narrow road. I didn't look back at the cabin once. As I drove away, I kept my eyes on the road and the trees that closed around it. For a long stretch of the drive, I kept feeling like something was moving through the forest alongside me, keeping pace just beyond where I could see. I didn't hear anything, I didn't see anything, but the feeling wouldn't leave. When I finally reached the highway, the weight in my chest loosened slightly, but not completely. Even now, long after leaving the cabin, I still think about those sounds. About the slow breathing, the scraping, the steps, the marks on the wood. There was nothing supernatural about it. There was nothing impossible. It was something real, something physical, something that lived in those woods. And when I think about it, the part that stays with me the most is not the fear I felt at night. It's the way the movements sounded. Slow, patient, controlled, like whatever was. I went to the old cabin at the edge of the northern woods because I wanted a quiet place to reset my mind for a few days. I had been dealing with too much noise in my life, and I thought being far away from everyone would help me think clearly again. The cabin was small and old, but it had electricity, running water, and enough space for me to rest. The place belonged to a friend's uncle who barely visited it anymore. I had the key and I knew the area well enough to feel safe going alone. I reached the cabin around late afternoon, the sun already dropping behind the tree line. The air smelled like wet soil and pine sap, and the ground was covered in scattered leaves that made soft cracking sounds under my boots as I unloaded my bags. The cabin sat on a small clearing surrounded by tall trees that leaned in slightly, as if they were trying to look into the windows. The wood on the cabin's walls was dark and worn from years of storms and winters. The door creaked in a tired way when I pushed it open. Inside, the air was cold and still. Dust hung in the light coming through the windows like slow-moving fog. The place looked exactly how I remembered it. A small bed in the corner, a table with uneven legs, a metal stove, and shelves stacked with old canned food. Everything felt frozen in time. I turned on the main light and the weak bulb flickered before settling. The cabin felt a little better with light inside it, less like something abandoned. I put my bags down, stretched my back, and decided to take a short walk before sunset. I wanted to get used to the quiet again. When I stepped back outside, the cold evening air brushed across my face, sharper now as the temperature dropped quickly in that area. The sun was almost gone, leaving long shadows between the trees. I followed a narrow trail behind the cabin that led deeper into the woods. The ground felt soft under my shoes, and the forest was so silent that I could hear the faint ringing in my ears that people usually notice in complete stillness. The trees stood close together, their branches tight like locked fingers overhead. The deeper I walked, the more I felt the weight of that silence. It was not peaceful. It felt like something was watching me, not in a supernatural way, but the way you feel when you step into an area that belongs to animals who don't care for strangers. After about 10 minutes, I turned back, not wanting to explore too much on the first evening. When I reached the cabin, the sky was now nearly dark. I grabbed some food from my bag and heated it on a small stove. The smell of warm canned soup filled the cabin, and the warmth felt good after the cold air outside. I sat on the bed as I ate, listening to the soft hum of the old refrigerator. For a moment, the place felt calm, almost comforting, but the quiet didn't last. Right after I finished eating, I heard something outside. It was faint, like a soft crunch of leaves under weight. At first I thought it was a deer. The woods were full of animals and the cabin wasn't exactly deep in the mountains. I kept still and listened. The noise came again, this time clearer, like something stepped slowly and heavily just beyond the cabin walls. I told myself it was nothing dangerous. The woods were home to deer, moose, maybe a bear passing through, but predators usually stayed away from areas with human smell. I ignored the sound and cleaned up my dishes, but the noise continued in intervals. It was slow and steady, like someone cautiously moving around the cabin. I walked to the window and looked out, but the darkness outside swallowed almost everything. The only thing I saw was the faint outline of the nearest tree. I leaned closer, trying to adjust my eyes, and for a brief moment I thought I saw movement between the trees. Something tall, something human-shaped. My chest tightened as I stepped back from the window. I reminded myself again that people rarely came out here. The nearest house was miles away, but the sound outside didn't stop. It circled the cabin slowly, step by step. It didn't sound like a four-legged animal. It sounded like someone walking upright. My heart began beating faster and my hands felt colder even though the cabin was warm inside. I turned off the stove and the main light to avoid being visible from outside. Only the small bulb near the bed stayed on, casting a weak glow. I stood still, listening, waiting for the next sound. The silence came for a moment, thick and suffocating. Then the footsteps continued, this time on the side of the cabin near the window I had just looked out of. I felt a pressure in my chest, the kind that grows when you know you're not imagining something anymore. I stayed low, moving quietly toward the bed. I didn't want to draw attention. I didn't want the thing or the person outside to know exactly where I was inside the cabin. Minutes passed, but the footsteps never moved far. They stayed close, like whoever was outside was waiting for something. I could hear the leaves crunch, then stop, then crunch again. It felt like time stretched out longer with every step I heard. My mind tried to come up with explanations. Maybe it was a lost hiker or someone from a nearby area, but nobody would wander in this remote place at night without calling out, without announcing themselves. The steps eventually faded. I waited a long time before I dared to move again. When the cabin felt quiet, I finally lay down on the bed. Even then, I couldn't close my eyes. I kept staring at the ceiling, listening for anything. Hours passed like that. At some point, I must have fallen asleep because I woke up to the faint light of early morning leaking through the window. The first thing I felt when I woke up was relief. The daylight made the cabin feel normal again. I got up, stretched, and stepped outside to check around the cabin. That was when I saw the footprints. They were clear as day, boot prints, not animal tracks. The soil was soft enough from last night's dampness that the prints held their shape. Someone had walked around the entire cabin. The prints went in a full circle, sometimes doubling back like whoever it was stayed out there for a long time. The direction of the prints showed they came from the woods behind the cabin and left in the same direction. I stared at them for a long time, trying to understand why someone would stand outside a cabin at night without knocking or calling for help or showing any normal sign of needing anything. It made no sense. I followed the tracks a little into the woods, but after a few meters the prints mixed with animal tracks and the ground got harder, making it impossible to follow. I returned to the cabin with an uneasy feeling inside my stomach. I spent the morning trying to distract myself. I cleaned the cabin, chopped some firewood, and tried to focus on the idea that maybe the person was just a hunter or a lost traveler who picked an odd way of moving around the cabin. But that didn't explain why they came so close to the windows, or why they circled repeatedly. As the day went on, I walked again along the nearby trail but stayed close to the cabin. I kept turning back every few seconds, feeling watched even though I never saw anything. The woods felt different that day. They felt alert, as if something moved just out of sight. The air carried a strange tension that made the back of my neck feel tight. By afternoon, clouds moved in and the temperature dropped again. I stayed inside for most of the evening, cooking some food and keeping the fire going in the stove. The sound of burning would help for a while, but as the sky darkened, I felt the same uneasiness return. I couldn't stop thinking about the footprints. When night finally arrived, I made sure all windows were locked. I turned off all the lights except one small lamp. I sat on the bed, listening, waiting, trying to convince myself that nothing would happen again. But it did. Late into the night, when the woods were the quietest, I heard it again. The first sound was soft, almost careful, like someone testing the ground with their foot. Then another, slow, steady steps moving toward the cabin from the backside. My breathing grew shallow as I sat still, frozen. The steps reached the walls. They moved along the side slowly, same as the night before. But this time something else happened. There was a soft scraping sound, like fingers brushing against wood or someone dragging something metallic lightly along the cabin wall. It moved around the cabin with the footsteps. I felt every muscle in my body tighten. My mind started racing, thinking of nothing but danger. The scraping grew louder near the window. I didn't want to look, but something inside me forced my eyes toward the glass. The window was too dark to see anything outside, but I felt something was standing right next to it. The scraping stopped. For a moment, I thought it was over. Then the window frame made a faint creaking sound, the kind it makes when pressure is applied on the edges. It felt like someone was leaning against it. My heart hammered so loud I was afraid whoever was outside might hear it. The person didn't move for a long time. It felt like a full hour went by even though it was probably just a few minutes. My legs were stiff, my back hurt from staying in the same tense position, but I didn't dare shift my weight or make a single noise. Eventually, the figure moved again. The footsteps went around the cabin one more time before fading back toward the woods. I stayed awake long after the sounds were gone, afraid that whoever it was might still be out there, just standing where I couldn't hear them anymore. When daylight came again, I was exhausted. My throat felt dry, my eyes burned, and my hands were shaking slightly. I stepped outside once more, and just like before, there were footprints circling the cabin. But this time there were more. This time, the footprints stopped right in front of the window I had been looking at. The soil there was pressed deeper than the others, as if the person stood there for a long time. I felt a heavy knot tighten in my stomach. It wasn't random. It wasn't accidental. Whoever it was, they had come for the cabin specifically. They knew someone was inside. I didn't want to stay another night, but I also didn't want to walk out into the woods alone with someone like that out there. I decided I would wait until midday when the sun was strongest and then pack everything quickly and leave before evening came back. The next hours felt painfully slow. I kept checking the windows, expecting movement, expecting someone to step out from between the trees. Every small sound the cabin made, a creak of the wood, a soft whistle of wind through the cracks, made me flinch. Around midday, I started packing. I moved fast, stuffing everything back into my bags without caring about organization. My hands shook as I zipped the last bag. I grabbed the key, put on my jacket, and stepped outside. Everything was quiet, too quiet. Even the usual bird sounds were missing. The trees stood still. The air felt heavier than usual, as if holding its breath. I walked toward my car parked near the front of the clearing. As I got closer, I saw something that made my chest tighten. On the side of my car door, just near the handle, there was a long smear of dirt, as if someone with a muddy hand had touched it recently. The smear wasn't there when I arrived. It hadn't been there the day before either. Someone had been near my car. Panic spread through me, but I kept moving. I opened the door, loaded my bags inside quickly, and sat behind the wheel. My breathing was fast and I gripped the steering wheel tightly. I started the engine and backed out of the clearing, glancing at the rearview mirror every second. The dirt road leading back to the main road felt longer than usual. Every turn made me feel exposed. Every shadow between the trees looked like it was hiding someone. Only when I reached the open road did I let out a long breath I had been holding without realizing. I didn't look back at the woods. I didn't look back at the cabin. I drove until the trees thinned out and cell service returned. The moment I had signal, I pulled over and sat in silence, letting the shock settle into something more solid. Even then, hours later, I couldn't shake the feeling that whoever had been outside the cabin had watched me leave. That somewhere among the trees, hidden by the darkness, someone had been waiting for me to come out. The strange part is nothing happened after I left. Nobody followed me. Nobody showed up at my home. There were no reports in the news about missing people or hunters in the area. Everything seemed normal on the outside, but the fear stayed with me. The thought of a stranger, standing silently in the dark, circling a cabin, watching through the windows, touching the car, never left my mind. The cabin was supposed to be a place to clear my thoughts, but instead it filled my mind with something heavier than anything I went there to escape from. I haven't gone back since. The key still sits in a drawer at home. Sometimes I think about throwing it away, but something stops me each time. Maybe it's the hope that someday I'll feel brave enough to face the cabin again. Maybe it's because part of me needs to know what or who was out there those nights. But deep down, I know I'll never return. The memory of those slow footsteps in the dark, circling over and over, is enough to tell me the woods around that cabin are not a place I should ever step into again. I had been driving for hours along a winding, narrow forest road that few people seemed to use. The trees pressed in on either side, tall evergreens and thick underbrush that made the shadows stretch unnaturally, even in the middle of the day. I had found a small cabin online while searching for a weekend getaway, a place isolated enough to let me escape the constant noise of the city and the endless work that never seemed to stop. The pictures were charming. A small wooden cabin nestled in a clearing, a thin wisp of smoke rising from the chimney, surrounded by dense forest. The owner promised quiet, solitude, and the kind of peace that only comes when there is nothing but trees and sky. When I finally arrived, the sun was already low, spilling gold and orange light across the road. The forest smelled damp and earthy, with the faint hint of pine and moss. The cabin itself was more weathered than the pictures suggested. The wood darkened with age, some boards warped or slightly cracked. It had a certain honesty, though, and I felt a small thrill of excitement at the thought of being completely alone for a few days. I parked my car near the edge of the clearing and unloaded my backpack. The forest around me was eerily still. The occasional chirp of a bird or rustle of leaves in the wind were the only signs of life. I pushed open the cabin door, which protested with a long creak, and stepped inside. The interior was small but functional. A tiny kitchen, a single room with a fold-out bed, a wood stove, and a small table. Dust lay thick on the floorboards, and the air smelled faintly of mildew and old wood. Still, I was used to cleaning and making places habitable, so I didn't mind. I spent the first hour unpacking, lighting a fire in the stove, and organizing my things. Outside, the light continued to fade, the shadows deepening, until the forest became a dark wall around the clearing. I could hear the wind through the trees now, a low moan that made the cabin feel smaller and more enclosed. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just the wind and the isolation playing tricks on my mind. By the time night fully descended, the forest had become almost completely silent, except for the occasional creak of branches or distant crack of wood falling. I sat near the stove with a flashlight on the table, eating some cold food I had brought, trying to focus on reading, but my eyes kept wandering to the windows. The darkness outside seemed unusually heavy, like a thick curtain pressing against the glass. Around midnight, I started hearing sounds I couldn't immediately identify. At first, I thought it was the usual forest noises. Animals moving, small branches snapping under the weight of unseen creatures. But then the sounds became more deliberate, soft thumps, almost like footsteps, moving slowly around the cabin. My heart rate spiked. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, maybe a deer or a raccoon, but the sounds were too regular, too careful. They weren't random like animal movements. I stood up, gripping a flashlight like a weapon, and slowly walked to the window. I shined the beam into the darkness, sweeping it across the clearing, the edge of the forest, anywhere I could see. Nothing moved. I tried to steady my breathing, convincing myself that my mind was playing tricks because of the isolation and darkness. I returned to the table, sitting stiffly, listening. The thumps had stopped. I forced myself to sleep eventually, though every creak of the cabin and every wind gust kept me on edge. In the morning, the sun rose weakly through the trees, casting pale light over the clearing. Everything seemed calm again, almost too calm. I stepped outside to stretch, examining the ground around the cabin. Nothing seemed out of place at first, but then I noticed faint footprints in the soft dirt near the edge of the clearing. They were small, human-shaped, and led toward the forest before disappearing into the underbrush. My stomach sank. I had locked the cabin door when I arrived, and the only way in was the front door. The footprints hadn't been there the night before.